There we go. We're live. What's
What's
up,
up?
everyone? Um, I
We
don't know how
forgot the
many people.
song today.
Oh, what were you gonna say? Go ahead.
We forgot the song today. We're gonna have to sing it.
Oh, dang. Do you know any good socialist tunes or any good folk songs?
I know a few. I can't sing though. You and Noah have to get going on that song you guys wanted to do.
I know. We seriously need like a Midwestern Mark specific like acoustic folk song.
Yeah, it'd be great for intros.
I can just play some fingerstyle, I guess. There we go. There's our intro song.
Yeah,
I
nice.
don't know if Justin Bieber's a socialist, but he should be. It was a Justin Bieber song.
You know what's funny is that when you get those like pop songs and you play them like that in acoustic, they sound so different. They sound like indie pieces, like cool, laid back indie pieces.
They do, and that's like a whole genre of like YouTube music now. It's like "Down with the Sickness" by Disturbed in like 1950s jazz style.
Oh my god.
Hello, Where Pilgrim. Well, dude, Carlos. Today I was doing a stream and we were reacting to one of Ramiro's videos,
Mm.
and I kept seeing Ramiro kept pulling up people's comments, and it was all people who like are also in our audience, like Where Pilgrim.
Hell yeah.
So great to see our audience is enjoying Ramiro's work. His interview with the lady from Press TV recently,
I
the
saw that.
Iranian lady, was so good.
Oh my god, it was amazing. It's yeah, it dispels so many myths that I had talked to him before he did the stream about how every time these things come up, they're like litmus tests of who's able to um, understand what the real principal problems in the world are and where they should place themselves. And you know, one of the things that I really appreciated Professor Radica and Professor Allen for mentioning with our in our interview is that the most important thing you could be right now is anti-imperialist first and socialist second. Um, and that's unfortunately a lot of these truths are not new, right? These are things that if you read the traditional Marxist-Leninist literature, this was just common sense, or it had achieved a level of common sense in the socialism of the 20th century, and it's common sense is no longer common. It seems so. Um, I notice it especially in our conversation, the conversations that I have with Tom, where we'll spend 4 hours talking, and a lot of the problems that we find online and that just dominate the discourse that everyone engages in. He's like, what the fuck? Like all these questions have been settled for a century. Everyone
Right.
knows what the answer is. But that
And that's
seems
why we want people to read so bad. It's like, you don't like the ideas and the debates that you're going over in your head, they've already been had between
mhm.
some of the smartest minds in the world. So like the level of arrogance you have to say like I don't want to engage with that or read that, it can't bring me any value is absolutely insane. I realized recently as I've been working on the Venezuela book. I obviously Venezuela was one of the ways that I came to socialism and came to be a socialist, just kind of researching it and seeing how much the U.S. had lied. But I remember when I first started moving that way, like the possibility came into my head, like maybe socialism does work, but imperialism has stopped it from working every step of the way. And obviously, like that's an oversimplification. There are internal contradictions which are
Mhm.
exacerbated by the external contradiction of imperialism. But pretty much, there has never ever been a socialist society that has not had to fight back against hybrid war or straight up intervention and warfare.
Right.
So it's almost like a return to that position now, a sublation of that original position I had, where you realize you really have to be anti-imperialist first.
Right. Right. And I had a similar moment like that with Cuba, which is that, if socialism doesn't work, why is there so much money and resources spent on like making it fail?
Right.
If it doesn't work, just let it collapse, right? If a swimmer can't swim, why would you institutionalize tying them up before every race? And they still finish the race. So how are you gonna tell me they can't swim if they're swimming and they got fucking chains tying their feet and their hands up, but they're still swimming. They're swimming with their neck or something, but they're swimming somehow. So don't tell me they can't swim. They can swim better than everyone else who doesn't have the fucking chains on.
And I mean, literally going back to that same, or going back to the economics class where I first started questioning Venezuela that I was talking about and that I'm writing about in the book. I had this really right wing anti Venezuela professor, and that was the first question I asked. It was like, okay, so if socialism always fails and socialism destroyed their economy, what's the purpose of 160 plus economic sanctions? Like, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to, prop up Juan Guaido in the opposition if socialism is going to fail anyways? And she's like, well, it'll accelerate the failure. And then, socialism will fail faster. And then we'll have less human rights abuses because socialism equals human rights abuses. And even as someone like who I was a junior in college at the time, I was like, this is the dumbest crap I've ever heard in my life. Like this, I'm sorry, this just doesn't make any sense.
Right, right. And what's funny is that not that it's not done by liberals, of course it is, but when it's done by conservatives, um, they're the same people that at the same time post videos about facts and logic. Facts and logic, defeating people with facts and logic. What are you talking about?
Right? Jiangju, our buddy, the Bolshevik beat maker, Bolshevik rapper from Taiwan, um, he says conservatives are right when they say that. They're just wrong about the facts. All their facts and logic are wrong. They never actually use it, but you should. And honestly, there's a push, or I don't know. It's easy to fall into just um like a leftist way of looking at the world. Like everyone who agrees with me is good and right, and everyone else is bad and wrong, and that's my politics. And I don't even have to engage with the arguments of a Ben Shapiro because they're stupid and racist. It's like they are, but you should engage with their arguments and steel man their arguments so you can explain why. And then that'll help you understand your own arguments better. So it's like you do want to engage with facts and logic, and facts don't care about your feelings, but Republicans put their feelings above facts, or at least Republican ideologues.
Right. Well, the one of the main slogans of the way that Chinese Marxism formulates dialectics has a slogan from Mao that then gets recaptured with Deng and the process of undoing some of the things, some of the extreme things that went on during the Cultural Revolution, is seek truth from facts, right? But their facts are not understood in the reified way in which like the right understands it. Um, they just understand facts as just like look at statistics and that's it, and then just base abstract judgments off of that. When the Chinese say seek truth from facts, or that part of the saying seek, I think that's really the essence of it, which is don't just go to the fact, go behind the fact, go around the fact, study the fact's history. It to understand the fact, you got to understand the factors that come that are around it. That's a way of phrasing it that comes unfortunately from Marcuse, which we have problems with. But I think it's a beautiful way of phrasing it because it, at least in English, it slips out of the tongue so nicely. you can't understand facts without the factors that allow them to be facts. And that's one of the basic premises of dialectics, and that might be a good segue into one of the things we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Sorry, I had something that I want to add that's like a little bit unrelated to what you want to
Yeah, yeah,
segue
go
into.
for it. Go for
But I just wanted to make it easier for people to understand. Like, some people know I like this music reviewer, Anthony Fantano. He reviews music, and some people have gotten on him before because he always compares an artist's work to their last work. And
it.
he compares an artist's work to other artists in the industry, or he talks about how relevant their work is to what's going on in the culture, politics. And people will say, why don't you just review the song for what it is? Why don't you just review the art for what it is? It's like, that's not how art works. Art is connected to everything. When you listen to an artist's work, if you listen to their albums over time, you hear the development of that artist, and that's part of what makes it fun. So there is no understanding a song without understanding, everything related to it, without understanding its context. There's no understanding a fact without understanding its factors. And this is the guy. He's actually like, I know he listens to a lot of like socialist or left-wing music, including like tanky music, as well as like some anarchistic type stuff too. But yeah, shout out to Anthony Fantano. He used to follow the Eddie Liger Smith account. I don't know if he follows our new one.
And that's fine. Like, incoherence like that is expected, and that's fine. Like, you can still work with it. But that reminds me of a quote that Engels has, which is that men, we could use people, be more inclusive, but people have been thinking dialectically before they even knew that they were thinking dialectically, right? And that thing that you were mentioning with Fontano and his reviews, and you see it in literature. Like, a good literary review is a dialectical one that understands the context in which the piece is written, that understands some of the effects, the relations, the history of it, the context of the person writing it, their relations, all that really gets into all the factors and the interconnection of those factors and the dynamics behind the piece itself, right? That doesn't just look at the piece and separate it from the world in order to analyze it in a sort of laboratory style manner. Um, and you see that in science, you see that in various areas. And what you're mentioning with Fontano, the way that he approaches music, that's a more dialectical way of approaching things, and it comes almost naturally, right? You come to realize, if you're a critical thinker, if you really sit down and really ponder what it is that you're investigating, you realize you have to do a little more than just look at it directly. So yeah, that's I think that quote is perfectly right. That there's men have been thinking dialectically before they understood that they were thinking dialectically.
Absolutely. And I've seen that with the Edward Baptiste book about Southern slavery in the U.S. that I wrote about, by giving an analysis of the economy and how it changed over time, plus an analysis of the culture and various class attitudes. He basically gives a dialectical materialist analysis without saying it. Parenti is the master of that, and his book about Caesar is probably the best because that was before Marx and dialectical materialism was in existence. And he's like, by Caesar basing himself in the masses and just fighting for their interests, he made himself just overwhelmingly popular. But then, the bourgeoisie or the aristocracy at the time wanted to kill him, which I think highlights the importance of the dialectical materialist worldview and the method, because, as Che Guevara would say, it's not my fault reality is Marxist. This isn't a religion. It's not a dogma. It's a lens for getting to the truth and analyzing reality. So, yeah, that's why we're super freaking pumped that Carlos just published this anthology, Classical Marxist Texts on Dialectical Materialism, that you can get at midwesternmarx.com. You got to go to store and then books. But yeah, congrats, Carlos.
Thank you. I wanted to mention, you were talking about Julius Caesar. I linked to the chat Dr. Riggins' review of Parenti's book on Caesar, which is really good. It might be good to read if you're interested in reading the Parenti book. But yeah, this is Man, there's so much work has gone into this book. Years of work to find the sources. There's a word that Riggins used to describe the process because he's been the one editing it and working through it with me, reading the introduction and um, watching over the selection. And if you can scroll up, I think oh no, it's right there, scored, that I scored through a bunch of literature. And that's exactly what I did. I had to read, probably a few dozen books, hundreds of articles, in order to select I think, 40 documents that are in there. And those 40 documents come from, like, I think 11 or 12 of some of the key Marxist theorists in the 19th and 20th century. So I go from Marx and Engels to Lenin to Plekhanov and Bukharin to Stalin and Mao to JBS Haldane to JD Bernal, Mosiah Ulgin, Ilyenkov. So a few people that perhaps are not as well known but are quite important thinkers in the Marxist Leninist tradition, and then some of the classics. And one of the interesting things about this book is that nothing like this has been done before that I know of in the English language, or that Riggins knows of. He mentions it in the beginning of the preface that really uh, there isn't an anthology, a collection of works about the about the dialectical materialism that collects a variety of thinkers from the Marxist tradition, and they're thinking about these issues specifically, right? Because you can see it in their work, and but to see it in their work, you have to understand how dialectics functions. So what I do is take the works where they're processing how it is that dialectics functions, what dialectics is, what the dialectical method is, what it looks like, what the outlook is, its application to the sciences. I take the works where they're specifically dealing with the concept of with the worldview of dialectical materialism and the different ways, the different aspects that they're focusing upon in this worldview, and I lump it all together in this one volume. And I'm hoping that it serves as a good reference book for students of Marxism and for people interested in the struggle for socialism, because it's really got the essence, I think, of what the worldview is. And if you have the worldview, you avoid a lot of the mistakes that surround 65% of the stuff that we cover. One of the concepts that we've tried to develop that we're all using now is the purity fetish, and we recognize that part of the benefit of this concept of the purity fetish is that it sees the flaws that we see in the predominant Western left not as disconnected issues, but as something that is connected. Like each flaw is connected to the other. This one-sided view of what the U.S. is connected to the rejection of socialist states, which is connected to the rejection of a big part of the proletariat as a basket of all of these things are connected to each other, and they stem from the outlooks that people approach the world with. And at the core of it, what you have is an absence of dialectical thinking, an absence of a consistently applied dialectical materialist worldview. So if this book helps people, which I think it should, if it helps them adjust their thinking in accordance with this worldview, they're going to avoid some of these mistakes. And by avoiding them, they're also going to avoid the practical mistakes that I think set the movement for socialism back.
Agreed. And I think this is so important. Like you said, it really hasn't been done before. And I notice, when I'm teaching people about Marxism who are new to it, the main thing that they want, is like guidance, or, almost like they want to have their hands held a little bit, but it's understandable, because you're indoctrinated and beat over the head with just these absurd lies about Marxism and given all these preconceived notions about what it is before you dive into it. So it creates this anxiety when you're reading it of like, am I understanding this or not? Is my
Mhm.
interpretation just totally wrong? Um, so that's like what we've tried to do with some of our book summaries, like with the Lenin's Imperialism and State and Revolution book summary, where we just summarize everything. That's almost holding someone's hand and teaching you theory as much as we can. Besides this, I'd say besides you creating this collection of some of the most classic, vital work that you've come across, and studying Marxism for years now, like you said, and guiding people through it. And I mean, that's like probably the number one request we have is, what do you read? What was your process of intellectual development? What books did you read? And we covered this on the stream a while back. I even tried to do this is Eddie Liger's step-by-step guide to understanding Marxism, and I thought it was pretty bad looking back, but we rewatched it the other day on stream, and it's fine. There's good books on here, and there's a lot of good classics, but it's hard to give people a step-by-step guide, or it's hard to distill the dialectical materialist worldview into just a handful of books or a handful of writings. But we need more of that. We need people to simplify these things and explain these things for everyone. So I think that's what this book is going to do. And yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty proud of everything we've published, but definitely this is up there.
And that's part of what I try to do in the introduction, because the collection of texts is itself really, really good if you want to engage with the original material. And there's obviously a lot to learn from it. That's what the texts in there are probably some of the most important and formative for my understanding of dialectical materialism. But what I try to do in the introduction is try to systematize all of it. So try to provide a coherent and comprehensive analysis of what the dialectical materialist worldview is, because it's confusing for some people, right? If they pick up, for instance, Engels's Dialectics of Nature, and they read the fragments that he has on dialectics, they start to see these three laws float around, right? The law of the unity and struggle of opposites, the law of quantity to quality and vice versa, and the law of the negation of the negation. But then they pick up Marx's introduction to the Grundrisse, where he's talking about the method, and they understand it's the dialectical method, and then they what they read is about the ascension from the abstract to the concrete. So what's the relationship of these two things? Both are talking about dialectics. One's talking about laws. The other one's talking about a method. So is it a method? Is it a series of laws? What is it, right? So what I try to do in this is think in all of the different focuses that the Marxist tradition has taken to speak about dialectics. What's the relationship that they all have to each other? And that's why I use the concept worldview. In German is Weltanschauung, because a worldview is composed of both an ontology, which is a series of comprehensive and coherent claims about what the constitution of the world is like. In more philosophical terms, a series of claims about being, and an epistemology, which is an examination of how it is that people engage with the world, the more subjective side of things. And ontology and epistemology are connected. And what I do is say that the ontology is an ontology of becoming, right? It's not an ontology of static being, as philosophy usually formulates ontologies. It's an ontology of becoming. It has a certain basic principles, such as, everything is in a constant state of becoming. Everything's in a constant state of flux, which you can trace all the way back to Heraclitean philosophy, into the ancient Greek world, right? Hegel used to say that there's not one proposition in Heraclitus that I don't accept in my system of philosophy and my science of logic. But that's just the abstract beginning. That's almost the first truth. The first, Hegel says that the first determinate concrete category is becoming, but it's still somewhat abstract, right? It's the first concrete, but it's still abstract. So once you say, well, everything is in constant movement, okay, that, but what else can you say about that? Well, you can investigate the general structures that movement takes, and that's where the laws of dialectics come in. And then you can go even deeper than that and examine, well, what sort of determinations do each law have in their own? And that's what Mao does. Mao says, okay, we have this general universal law of contradictions, which says that everything that moves because it is composed of opposing forces. But there's the particularity of contradictions that we have to look at. The particularity of contradictions. You have the general law, and then there's the particularities. And that's a process of concretizing the understanding of dialectics.
Mm.
And then he examines and he says, well, there's antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, which that is a distinction that he systematizes. It was already in Lenin, but he systematizes it. And then in every case, there's a principal and a non-principal contradiction. And within every process that contains a unity of opposites, one of those poles is going to be the dominant factor. And that's what he calls the principal aspect of contradiction. So you have in Mao a further concretization of the ontology of dialectical materialism. And I develop all of that in the ontology section. And then I examine questions about categories, right? And philosophy categories are, for instance, in Kantian philosophy, the categories of the mind are how you end up structuring your understanding of the world. So they function as a sort of cognitive filter to how you come to know the world. For the dialectical materialist, the categories are not in the mind, they're in the world. You can reflect on the categories because they're in the world. And so I look at the traditional categorical dichotomies that you find in philosophy, part and whole, quantity, quality. I look at a series of these dichotomies and I say, well, how do we think about this? And the first major point that you have to make is that, well, you have to think about them in the world. We can only reflect on them because they're objectively in the world. So I do all those things. I treat the understanding of categories within ontology, and then I also switch over to epistemology, which is the part where I consider the method to be, and that method is the ascension from the abstract to concrete. And so in doing that and examining each one of those components, both on its own, but with an understanding that none of them are separate, that you come to understand the ontological truths of the world dialectically related to the development of that method. Um, in doing so, I think that I can help people avoid some of the confusions that arise when you read one thing, you read another, and you're like, well, he's talking about a method here, he's talking about some laws here, they're both talking about dialectics. What the hell's going on?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was getting at when I said people want their handheld. It's like they want a timeline or a guide. Like, what do I read first? And what do I try and understand first before I move on to the next thing? When some things seem contradictory, like you said. So that's why I think your book is so helpful. And just listening to you talk there and give a short little summary of it or talk about some of the ideas you discussed. It reminds me of, for one, people who say that, Marx himself never said dialectical materialism, or Marx, never said systematized diamat specifically, except for, kind of the German ideology, which we now know is just a collection of writing and stuff. But, that doesn't mean just because Marx was busy throwing himself into economics and trying to flesh out his philosophy as much as he could when he before he died, he never got a chance to fully systematize everything. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done. It's still extremely important to systematize these ideas so we can disseminate them. And if you think about the way that capitalism works, and you can think about like Althusser's repressive state apparatuses, the different ways that capitalism maintains hegemony ideologically, and as well as in other ways. But they institutionalize and systematize the dissemination of their ideas, of capitalist bourgeois ideology. They, while your parents are working, being exploited, you go to school where, there's a curriculum set by the capitalist state. Where you're going to be taught to never question the system as it exists. So, if we want to combat this, we have to systematize and disseminate our own ideas. We have to systematize and disseminate the truth. But yeah, it's better because we have the truth, right? That's the thing. They're lying. They have more power and wealth, but they're lying.
Right.
We have the truth on our side. It's just a matter of putting the work in to get that truth out to people, which I think your book is going to do. And it reminds me of some, I read Che's, what is it? Socialism and the Man in Cuba. Is that the name of the
Socialism and
essay?
Man in Cuba. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Carlos had read it a bunch. I'd read it a while back, but I reread it today. And he talks about institutionalizing the revolution, and that
Mhm.
being, such a huge struggle for socialists, really constructing this dictatorship of the proletariat. Like after you smash the ready-made state apparatus, the capitalist state apparatus, how do you rebuild a state apparatus that's directly linked to the people? So we need to institutionalize, I guess, or systematize these ideas or our ideas so we can disseminate them and educate people in a systematic way. And the last thing is, uh, people say that Mao and Lenin and folks like that maybe didn't write their own theory because mostly what they do is quote Marx and Engels. But that's exactly, same idea. They're systematizing the ideas of Marx and Engels, including ideas like dialectical materialism, which maybe Marx and Engels never did themselves. And then, obviously, in the case of Mao and Lenin, very successfully disseminating those ideas to the working mass.
Right. Right. And that's thank you, Ross, for the $5.
Thank you.
That's a really good point. Neither Marx nor Engels ever used the term dialectical materialism. Engels does say the materialist dialectic, but the first person to use that term is Joseph Dietzkin. But one of the things that happens with Marx, he's given in 1857 the science of logic that belonged to Bakunin. He's by a mutual friend. He gives them some of the books that were in Bakunin's closet, and one of them is the Science of Logic. And Marx says that he read it, he reread it, and then he started writing the Grundrisse. And there's the letters from this time to Engels and to other comrades and fellow scholars show that the rereading of the Science of Logic was extremely influential for Marx. And the first section, towards the end of the first section of the Grundrisse, you have a section on method, and in that method, the method of ascension from the abstract to concrete. That's the method in Hegel in the Science of Logic, right? What you have in the Science of Logic is the constant concretization of the concept. Hegel's concept is constantly being concretized through the categorical unfolding of the Science of Logic. But one of the things that he says in one of these letters is that he hopes whenever he's done writing Capital and to write 2 or 3 sheets systematizing the laws of dialectic that Hegel had already found, but that he inverted in a mystified form by attributing them to the idea and not to material reality. And then he also says in another letter, I believe it was to Dietzkin, it might have been to Engels, but he says in another letter that he hopes to write dialectics, and he put it in between quotes as he wanted to do a pamphlet on dialectics. So when Marx dies, the first thing that Engels goes to look for, and we know it was the first thing because he sends a letter to a Russian scholar letting them know what he was looking for. The first thing he goes to look for is that dialectics text. And he couldn't find it because Marx never wrote it. He never got around writing. So that was sad. Yeah, that's sad on all of us. Engels does try to indirectly systematize dialectics in Dialectics of Nature, which is an unfinished book. I would definitely recommend for those interested in the history of Dialectics of Nature to read the book by Khan Kangal, which is called Frederick Engels and the Dialectics of Nature. It was published last year. I have a review on it in Midwestern Marx that you should check out. But one of the things that appears in that book is various short fragments where he's talking about dialectics, some fragments where he's focusing on the relationship of categories, and famous quotes, famous phrases from there arise, such as, neither in heaven nor in earth is there such a black or white either or such hard and fast lines between two things. Which, if you read Hegel, that sort of phraseology comes from Hegel. And then there's other sections where he's saying, these are the 3 laws of dialectics. Here's what they mean. And so he does get to do that. He doesn't finish it. So the closest thing we have to what Marx had wanted to do, which was 2 or 3 sheets on dialectics, is Lenin's article on the question of dialectics, which again was unpublished. It was published after Lenin died, and it's really good. The person who translated and introduced Marx's Grundrisse, his name Martin Nicolaus, one of the things that he says is that the person who best systematized dialectics was Lenin in that short article on it. And then that Mao expanded upon that with his essays on contradiction and on practice.
What about the I've never read it, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Is that a
Mm.
systematization of dialectics at all? I know that's just what Lenin like thinks about philosophy, is what Riggins has told me.
Right, right. It's a really good text. It's an early text from Lenin, and I think the text is largely correct. His positions on materialism are largely correct, but it's written quite a few years before Lenin gets the chance to really dig into Hegel.
Ah,
And one of the things that you and I have both noticed, I had to spend more than a year just focusing on reading Hegel, and you've spent quite a few months now doing something similar, is that there's a transformation in your thinking that occurs when you read Hegel. So Lenin reads Hegel in 1914. Um, and his works after that are a lot richer. That doesn't mean, as some people, like Raya Dunayevskaya and some other trots have tried to argue, that there's two Lenins, the one before and the one after he read Hegel. I think Materialism and Imperial Criticism is a great book and it should be read. But his thoughts on dialectics, I think, are much richer in his conspectus to Hegel's logic, which is
mm.
basically his notes while he's reading Hegel, which are included in volume 38 of Lenin's collected works. It's otherwise known as the Philosophical Notebooks. And in that volume, he also has a summary of dialectics at the end, which I have included, of course, in this collection because it's terrific. And he makes like 12 points of some of the main points after he's done reading the science of logic. And then there's, of course, that short piece on the question of dialectics. So Materialism and Imperial Criticism is a really good book. It provides a really good challenge to this trend of mechanistic materialism, the Machist. And I would also recommend for anyone interested to pick up the Reading the Classical Text of Marxism from Thomas Riggins, because a big chunk of the book is him summarizing, analyzing, and updating materialism and imperial criticism.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great read for anybody. I love all of Riggins' work, updating these books for like modern day, and where he thinks that Engels or Lenin were wrong, he says he thinks they were wrong and they need to be updated, which is, how a science should work. Um, I want to pause, or not pause, but we have Marxist Saw here, Marxist Arkansas, talking about Darwin a little bit.
Mhm.
He says Marx told LaSalle in a letter that Darwin was a big inspiration of his work. I have to go find that letter, and then later he put it in here. Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in natural science for the class struggle in history. One has to put up with the crude English method of development, of course. Despite all deficiencies, not only is the death blow dealt here for the first time to teleology and the natural sciences, but their rational meaning is empirically explained. Marx LaSalle. And I agree that Darwin was a huge inspiration on Marx and Engels. Obviously, they didn't see him as being like dialectical enough, and that's kind of where they took his work in that direction. But hugely inspired by him, because if you think about historical materialism, and understanding historical development over time, and how the one thing leads to another, one thing and one event can be the precondition for the next. Darwin's sort of tracing the analysis of species, or the change of species over time. It's very related. It's almost a historical materialist analysis. And there's another anthropologist named Lewis Henry Morgan. Or I don't know if Darwin would he's a Darwin's evolutionary biologist, but there's an anthropologist named Lewis Henry Morgan who Marx and Engels are similarly impressed by his anthropological work, which they think is basically, a historical materialist analysis. And him, along with Darwin, are hugely inspirational, and not only the dialectical materialist method, but some specific books like this. Engels mentions Darwin and especially Lewis Henry Morgan many times. And another book Marx wanted to write before he died was basically this, Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, but his own version. So Engels used Marx's notes, especially Marx's notes when he was reading Lewis Henry Morgan and Darwin, to write this book. So this one is so freaking underrated. This is a great book for understanding dialectics too. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and that relationship between Darwin and Marx is so fundamental. I recommend the work of John Bellamy Foster. His first book, Marx's Ecology, it deals a lot with the relationship of Darwin to Marx, and Darwin really lays I don't know if laying the crucible is the right analogy, but he really provides the death blow to Aristotelian essentialism in biology and completely destroys that. And it's a shift towards thinking about life and development in terms of motion versus in terms of these static essences that just stay as they are forever, which was the predominant Aristotelian view of things. Marx takes a lot, of course. Engels was actually one of the first people in the world to read Darwin. A week or so after The Origins of Species is published, Engels is sending letters to Marx telling him how Darwin's the confirmations in the field of biology are basically confirming the method that they had basically been employing since the mid 40s when they're working on the articles for a journal that never took off, but the articles end up composing what we now call the German ideology. So Darwin was extremely influential. There has arisen in the 20th century some interesting critiques of Darwinism uh, for not being dialectical enough, and specifically, I would recommend the book by Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin. It's called The Dialectical Biologist. And one of the things that it argues is that the Darwinian account of evolution doesn't take enough into account the role of agency. Since it's a theory of adaptation, it's really just uh, the organism adapting to both internal and external conditions. And they felt that that was one-sided because the same conditions that shape the organism retroactively shapes it. You shape those conditions which shape you, and it's a dialectical, more reciprocal relationship. So that's some of the critiques that the Marxist tradition, specifically Marxist scientists like Levins and Lewontin, who I believe they were both in Harvard, or one of them was in Harvard, the other one was in another really big, I think, Ivy League school. But that's one of the critiques that they have provided sense of Darwin, which I think it's fair. It's a really good critique, and the development that they have brought about in the theory of evolution has been really, really important. But I think Eddie's getting back now. There we go.
Sorry, I was like, I hope Carlos has enough to talk about.
I went into a rant about Levins and Lewontin and their critique of Darwin. So,
Hmm.
but
Dang, I wish I could have heard that. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch it.
I would recommend this book to everyone. It's a collection of essays. It's called The Dialectical Biologist.
Hmm.
It was one of the first books I read a little over a year ago when I started getting into the themes of Marxism and science, and how dialectical materialism fits into the sciences. And it's really wonderful. There's one of the things that I try to include in this book um, that you have here. Uh, one of the things that I try to include is the scientist, because there's a tendency there's a lot of bad tendencies in Western Marxism, but one of them is to stop focusing on science, right? And the tendency of the Frankfurt School, they look at science as just positivism, and they provide somewhat fair critiques, but um, they don't see that science can benefit a lot from the dialectical materialist worldview, and that almost in every era of the 20th century, you can find in various parts of the international scientific community Marxists who are using dialectical materialism to advance the sciences, and that have had very important advances to the sciences. So one of the things that I tried to do in this book is also emphasize that connection of Marxism to science, which I hope that in the coming months, maybe we can schedule an interview with Elena Sheehan. She wrote a really wonderful book that both Riggins and I are reading now, which is called Marxism and the Philosophy of Science. And it traces, as best as anything I've ever seen in my life, the relationship of Marxism to the science, literally by looking at every single current in the history of Marxism. But anyways, I try to incorporate scientists into this volume. So I add articles from J.D. Burnell and J.B.S. Haldane. Both of them were British communists in the party. So we're not talking about just academics in academia not doing anything. They were Communist Party members, militants, writing popular articles on Marxism and science for the masses, to educate the masses. So I've read a ton of their work, and I collected some of the articles where they're trying to really distill what dialectical materialism is, and I've included them in this volume.
Awesome. Sorry, I was talking to someone in the comments a little bit. Uh, yeah. I mean, I'm excited to read this myself too, because there's a lot of people like that, or a lot of lesser known writers, or Soviet based writers who I haven't read, who you talk about, who I'm excited to dig into. Iwido in the comments was talking about how Darwinism is incorporated into bourgeois economics, which we were talking about the other day with Alan Freeman and Radhika Desai, and it is absolutely. I was saying it's just a vulgarized form, though. It's like Darwin said, "Survival of the fittest." So therefore, capitalism is the best, and they're not actually, because bourgeois economics, neoclassical economics, has no understanding of history at all, because they think that the market is the dominant, or the market is basically a religion. The market is the best way to do everything. It's like, well, what about before commodity markets existed? And they have no answer for these questions. It's like, well, that time sucked, but now we have the holy market. So yeah, they vulgarized Darwin, but yeah, I had something else to say about what you were saying.
It's really Richard Spencer a lot of the time. The ideas of Spencer that pass for Darwin's that they end up using, especially those that ground scientific racism, and that ground some of the ideas of modern economics, and how they try to pass themselves as a scientific. So
yeah, absolutely. Vulgarized form, like we were saying, not a way that actually tries to engage with Darwin. But I have a question for you. I remembered what I wanted to ask. Do you know how the church reacted to Darwin immediately? Because obviously, the church would come to have a bunch of beef with teaching evolution in schools, at least in the West or the U.S. Probably not in Europe, but in the U.S. So was that the same at the time? Because I mean, just growing up in like an evangelical Christian community and family, it was like Darwin was like enemy numero uno. And if you went to church and you said, my teacher wanted me to write a paper about Darwin, but I refused because I'm dedicated to God, so I can't even engage with Darwin. You'd get a pat on the back at our church. So I mean, and obviously that's just how church, how religions used to provide a bulwark to scientific thinking or historical materialist thinking. But what was the reaction of the church at the time? Since we're just getting on a little Darwin tangent now.
well, the, most of what I've read on this topic has came from Foster.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he mentions is that not only is it difficult for Darwin to get his ideas out because of the church, and the rejection that the church provided to this, which, as you mentioned, it's a rejection that's ongoing. They have formally tried to pass the view that the two views are compatible: the view of the church and the view of Darwinian evolutionism. But of course, there was a lot of tension, and not only was there tension in terms of the church, but also in terms of the institutions that Darwin was in. So one of the things that uh, John Bellamy Foster talks about is this manuscript that Darwin had worked on. I think a couple of decades before the origins of species. That was a really good manuscript that had basically um, not really predicted, but laid the groundwork for what he ended up doing later, and he suppressed it because the time wasn't right. It was too materialist, and it was also too dialectical. Right? If you challenge the idea that there were these essences that were static, and that the role of science was just to find these essences. If you challenge that idea, that was very dangerous, right? So Darwinian evolutionism challenges both ideas of idealism because it's materialist, and it also challenges essentialism because it's dialectical. It's evolutionary. Now, it's not the best dialectics, but it is dialectical. It does see things in a process and things developing out of these processes.
Hmm. Interesting. I remember reading in Origins, Ingalls talks about the way that Lewis Henry Morgan's work was systematically suppressed at first.
Hmm.
And it was suppressed because it made so many breakthroughs,
Right.
because, it made so many breakthroughs in the field of anthropology. There were all these bourgeois English anthropologists who had their theories blown out of the water, and they did everything they could to suppress anyone from reading Lewis Henry Morgan. Um, uh, I had something else I was gonna say, but yeah, and I wish, I honestly wish Christians or people who have spirituality would read Darwin, because it's really, just the church vulgarizing Darwin and then saying, this is against everything in the Bible. Like, it's not. You could totally believe that species change over time, and there's overwhelming evidence for this. That doesn't disprove, that there's some sort of spiritual element to the world, or there's, some sort of divine creator. You could have a divine creator who created the world in the way that it develops. We know everything develops and is in constant change, so why wouldn't species be different? Why? And how is that against, spirituality? I don't understand. I wish people would actually read Darwin, because, like, once I started reading Darwin, I remember even in high school, I was like, I don't even understand how this is opposed to the church. Like, um, so yeah, if you're someone, I know we have a lot of people in our audience with, spirituality, of various different faiths. So yeah, don't be afraid of knowledge. I guess that was something too, like reading Capital, and I've had this conversation with my brother, because he's more into faith and stuff than I am these days. So it's still a huge part of his life. But he's also like an engineering major, and he's got a 4.0 student double majoring in Spanish. He's one of those type of guys. Um, and we've talked about, like, how the more you learn and the more you learn about material reality, the more you kind of peel away and dismantle these dogmas that you have in your head, or these preconceived notions that you have in your head about the world. And you realize a lot of them are informed by your faith and your religion and your upbringing, going to church every Sunday as a kid. So you just inherently, start to question those ideas or sublate those ideas, and they start to become something new. And, after a while, you have to stop, you stop holding on to that bulwark against knowledge, that, oh, I don't want to read something that I don't like. I don't
Mm.
want to read something that goes against what I believe. It's like, whatever. I'm just going to, entertain these thoughts and allow myself to think freely and critically and non-dogmatically, and see where that takes me. Um, and my brother said the same thing. He's like, yeah, you realize, um, how well humans kind of understand the world scientifically and stuff. and it makes you question this divine creation thing. But then my brother said, and like I said, he's still into his faith and stuff. He's like, well, like, engineers can make planes fly, but we don't exactly know what makes them fly, right? We know how to keep them in the air. We know the kind of numbers and calculations we need to keep a plane in the air, but we don't necessarily know, what is making it fly or why we have to fly it that fast. And he's like, discovering that mystery and explaining that mystery is, like God to him, or that's, part of God's design. It's like, this is where spirituality isn't necessarily contradictory with Marxism on an individual level, right? Where it becomes contradictory with Marxism is when you're holding those bulwarks, right? When you're like, no, it's not class struggle that drives history. It's literally God, making decisions and moving people around like chess pieces. Like, well, that's not dialectical materialism, but you can have a faith that's compatible, and to liberation theology is all about in a lot of ways.
Right, right. And I think you're right. A lot of the things um, that drive the incompatibilities are church dogmas that have been inherited since the hegemonization of Christianity within the Roman Empire in the third century. Because before that, Christianity, from what I've read, was more so seen as an ethic, as a way of relating yourself to other people. Um, as a basically the slogan now, what would Jesus do? But Christianity was more so seen as an ethic, and what was important was love, right? Being in a community of love, and that's where God was supposed to be. God was just love and community. And there's some, traditions in Catholicism and in Christianity which still hold that. I remember that I was very dogmatically atheist. I'm still, I'm not a believer, but I in undergrad, and we went to a Catholic private school that forced us to take a Catholic traditions course, and I left it for the last semester of my senior year. And when I took it, I
Same.
was like, "What the hell? This is kind of cool," because it was so close to socialism, or at least in terms of ethics, what it prioritized. It was not compatible at all with like the way that religion is used to support capitalism, or the way that it was used to support any other class society, right? So we had to read Flannery O'Connor. We had to read um, Father, I think it was Father Himes. We had to read a bunch of theologists, and I had read some for philosophy, some of the older ones, and I knew that there was thinking there that was incompatible with capitalism. Some of the stuff from St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, definitely. St. Augustine basically argued for like a sort of poverty communism of
Mm.
sorts, an aesthetic communism. But yeah, what you find is a lot of distortions that have been grounded on centuries of dogmas that are not necessarily connected to the early teachings of the church. And what's interesting is that Engels, towards the end of his life, started a project which Kautsky ended up taking up, which was an analogy of the early Christian communities as anti-imperialist communities of struggle and the development of modern socialism. So that's one of the things I wanted to mention. The other one was you were talking about you and your brother and the desire to know. That is the spirit of enlightenment. Sapere aude, dare to think, dare to know, and that's what Kant labels as the spirit of enlightenment in his essay, "What is Enlightenment?" Which I'm going to continue to push all of you guys so that one day we read it for a cadre school formation, because I think that when you read the essay, you realize that universal enlightenment, which he's talking about, is impossible under capitalism. It can only be done under socialism. um, and we've seen that only socialist countries are able to elevate the cultural life of their people to the point where that distinction that arises in capitalist society between alta cultura and cultura popular, high culture and popular culture, is overcome, and popular culture becomes high culture. The other thing that I wanted to mention related to that and your brother, um, was a strain of theology called fideism. which stems from I don't know if it stems from Kierkegaard, but one of the main fideists is Kierkegaard, and there's this idea that faith is wholly incompatible with knowledge. If you have knowledge of God, you can't have faith. Faith is based on this leap that you make. And the way that I used to um, think about this when I was in undergrad, that I had to take my exams about all of these people, I came up with an example, which was that if you have, if you're like in a body of land that's right in front of a body of water, and you see this patch of grass, and if you tiptoe with your foot and you try to tap the grass to see if it's solid, to know if you can jump in, you're not taking a leap, right?
Mm.
There's no faith. There's knowledge there. You're trying to investigate whether the thing is sturdy enough for you to go in. The point that Kierkegaard is making is that faith requires a leap, which is fundamentally against knowledge, right? That's something beyond knowledge. And so I think that um, your brother might be interested in that, because that would be a way of keeping with
Mm.
knowledge, while also understanding that a lot of the things that might come out of the church and religion, even if they're incompatible with that, that faith doesn't require knowledge. You can have faith through a leap that's something beyond knowledge.
Huh, that'd be perfect. I'll definitely recommend that to him. What I've given him so far is Jesus Christ Liberator.
Mm.
I don't know if he's read it yet, but I think it's less liberation theology, which is Catholicism, and I think it's based on like Protestant religions, making them compatible with Marxism. I haven't read it myself, but I also got him a copy of Capital for when he graduates, just because I think every engineer should read it,
Hmm.
because it's so easy to see as an engineer when you're dealing with these outlays of tools, of factories, means of production. It's very easy and interesting to read what Marx is saying about that. So uh, yeah, I got him that, and I mean, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I want to see if he reads it and see what he thinks, because he's a really smart kid. But
We need more
yeah.
scientists, more Marxist scientists, especially in the West. We don't have. Well, to be fair, there's this project that I was able to publish my article in, called "Science for the People," which I would recommend them. I think all of them are Marxists, and they're all scientists, and they write about science from a Marxist, dialectical materialist perspective. I was able to publish an article there regarding the recent study on serotonin,
Mm.
confirming that there's no link between serotonin levels and depression, but it's not as popular as I think it should be. And the thing is that Adam Schaff, who was a Polish Marxist, the director of some of the major Marxist institutes in socialist Poland, um, one of the things that he criticizes the Western Marxist and the humanist tradition that he himself was in part a part of, was that they completely reject Marxism as scientific socialism. What they end up sticking to is just morality. And you see that because they shift the focus from economics to culture. They begin to reject science and the influence of Marxism on science. They see Marxism as just something that deals with human society, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the interesting things that Schaff points to is that when they do this, they make it easier to defeat Marxism. They
Mm.
make it easier to defeat Marxism. If you are an ideologue, a pundit of the owning class, an agent of the ruling hegemony, it is much easier to defeat a counter hegemonic project that's just based on morals. But if you have one that's based on scientific investigation, as the stuff being developed in the Soviet Union and by the British communists and by various Marxist scientists, and also scientific studies of the economy, as Marx was able to produce because of the dialectical materialist method. That's a whole other monster to beat. That's a more difficult battle that you have. Then if you have, just socialism as an ethic, you should have an ethic, obviously. And, this might serve as a nice segue to a project that we are embarking on with Che and ethics. But it's a lot easier to beat socialists who are grounded on just ethics than to beat socialists who have that weapon of science that they can apply dialectical materialism. As Engels said, Marxism's best working weapon and sharpest tool to the world to understand it concretely, and then also have an ethic on top of that that helps to move the masses.
Yeah, I made a video, and I think this will be a good transition. I actually have the Socialism and the Man in Cuba pulled up so we can talk about it in a sec. But I made a video once where AOC was, supporting imperialism somehow because, the imperialists weaponized compassion, said, you're evil if you don't vote for this, sanctions or whatever. And she voted for him. I'm like, her socialism is based in morality. It's like, whatever sounds right. Tax billionaires and give people health care. Okay, that sounds good. That sounds like the moral thing to do. But there's no scientific analysis or understanding of the empire. And, AOC herself could be a CIA plant for all we know. But, a lot of the social democrats and DSA people and people who support AOC fall into the same kind of trap. And I remember someone made a response video to that and said I was racist, and I was saying that morality is only for brown people. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, no, theory is for everybody of every color, of every creed, every person who wants to struggle for socialism. A weapon is the perfect word. It is a weapon against the ruling class. And the more you read, the more you sharpen that weapon. And the more effective of an organizer you become. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You want to? AOC is CIA probably, Eddie. I mean, her origin story is bizarre. Like, she's been connected to, sketchy institutions and groups for a long time. But I wanted to go back just a little bit before we move on to Che a bit, and say, oh, I like that you said you saw in the study of Catholicism, because I took those same classes at Carlos and I went to the same private Catholic college, for those who don't know.
I wonder if we had the same professor.
Who was your professor?
I can't remember his name. He was
some really old dude who loved Catholicism.
Wathier.
Oh no, he's the man though. I've had him for.
He was in Princess Diana's wedding.
Really?
Yeah, the dude was a fucking beast. I got him to commit to caucus for Bernie. He was pretty awesome.
Nice. He
was
so
cool. Smart. I've never been around a person that just being around them, you feel this aura.
Yeah.
And you felt that around him, and I didn't believe it. I had my religious friends from the baseball team. They would always say that. I'm like, that's bullshit. And I had him as a professor, and it was like, well, yeah, that's. And then I also became somewhat friends with him. I was always the kid that would stay after class to talk about, what was discussed in class with the professor. So
he's so fun to talk to.
He's so good. Yeah, he was so smart.
He's been huge because, like I said, my brother and my sister are pretty into faith, and he's a religious studies teacher and similarly skeptical of institutionalized religion and stuff like my brother and sister are, and left-leaning politics. Obviously voted for Bernie, and he's been huge in their intellectual development, and even just like helping my sister especially get settled at school, and like all the different factors outside of the classroom that affect your life as a student. He's the kind of professor who will take the time to care about stuff like that. So this is a guy that, even though he's not a Marxist or whatever, like, really respect him, and maybe he would be a Marxist if you read it, but just shows why you should engage with everything and talk to everyone and be open-minded and not write people off because they're a religious studies professor and you're a Marxist.
He loved Hegel too.
Did he?
When I was heading off to grad school, I told him that I wanted to focus on Hegel and Marx, and he had opened up to Marx quite a bit through the semester. I had to do presentations on some of the key liberation theology people, so I had to read their books, and I started engaging with stuff that argues that Marxism is compatible with Christianity, and I was engaging in discussions with him about it, and he was opening up more to it. But we were really lucky at the school we were in, because another of the fathers that we had, Johnson, he ended up becoming the bishop, I think, of one of the major cities in Iowa. And he was another genius, just extremely smart guy.
Huh. Yeah. It's interesting you say that about Hegel. Well, first I just want to finish what I was starting my original rant on, I was saying that growing up Protestant, I also saw things that I thought were cool in the Catholic religion when we were learning about it. Mostly seeing God in communion, and
Mhm.
see the ways that they see God are like, seeing community and humans togetherness, and unalienated cooperation, despite living in capitalism was a lot of what I saw in the Catholic social teachings, which my father was born and raised Catholic and eventually left the Catholic Church because he has issues with it. I still think that was the correct decision. I would do the same thing, but it was interesting to see that oh, there is a lot of stuff here. Oh, I see why people like this, or why there's something universally attractive about this religion. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the leap of faith, because
Mm.
I mean, you and me notice all the time, like your secular upbringing just is created some differences in the way that we think versus my religious upbringing. We just have had a different background, like we dove into Marxism with a different, preconceived set of beliefs and
Mhm.
knowledge and understandings. And like, for me, that leap of faith was something I started to figure out in, like, in high school. Like I'm trying to convince myself, that I wouldn't say I'm totally unspiritual and stuff today, but um, I would try and convince myself of the fundamentalist understanding of the Bible. The world's only a few thousand years old, and God made it, like that, and all this stuff. And what I realized was I couldn't make myself make that leap, right? Because I was always a smart kid. I always liked reading and trying to understand the world. And that leap, trying to make it every single day, would give me so much anxiety. Versus Marxism, I became a Marxist pretty quick when I learned what it was. But then I immediately was like, I got to read more. I got to understand if this is actually the truth. I got to know if this is actually right. And if it's not, I got to change. And the more I learned, the more I was like, this is, the more correct it felt, the more truthful it felt. And, also the more I realized that I don't know, and the more I realized that there's so much to learn. But, it's the exact opposite of that, leap of faith and say, okay, just, I have everything figured out and that's that. It's, I have nothing figured out. So I have to, continue learning. And sorry, to conclude what I was saying, what I wanted to start with, when you say Wathier, the religious studies professor, understood Hegel really well. Um, we had that conversation too, where that was really a struggle for you. You hadn't,
Mm.
Hegel talks about religion a lot, uses it as, a literary method to explain dialectics, talks about the role of philosophy and religion, their relation to one another, how philosophy appears in religion, but it's not, philosophy itself, because it's not thinking for. Anyways, but I don't want to try and get into Hegel and trip up over my words right now. But that was like not easy for me to understand because it's still Hegel. But like when I hit the parts where he was talking about religion, and the way that religion is like a mystified form of philosophy almost, it made perfect sense to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just like absolutely right. Because you know, like if you're a Christian like my parents were, who actually read the Bible, and my dad would read Proverbs to us every night, which is just like basically quotes about wisdom, and how to live a good life and how to be a good person. Like you are thinking pretty philosophically, right? You're still thinking like, how do I live my individual life based on this theory, that I believe is all completely correct. So you're not really thinking critically, but you are sort of thinking in a philosophical way. How do I live my life? What principles do I live my life by? So people who are raised religious, I think, are kind of predisposed to start thinking philosophically already.
Mm.
Not that obviously secular people can as well. But and then the last thing I'll say, I just know I brought up this book forever ago, Jesus Christ Liberator by Leonardo Boff.
Yeah.
That's I got my brother. So
Yeah, both is great. He was working with the other one, Gustavo. Do you remember the last name? I had to do. That's the one that I did the presentation on.
what
Um, is it? I think it was Gustavo Gutierrez. It was both Gutierrez, uh, um, Medina. I think I have some of the books back here. I wasn't able to bring my whole library. more than like 80% of my books. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
it's very interesting because Hegel's using religion as an analogy to sort of help uh, depict almost metaphorically what he sees spirit doing. And spirit is something that it sounds idealistic when we use the word spirit, but I mean, there's ways in which we use spirit today that we realize, oh, it's not idealistic. Like when we talk about the spirit of the age, right? We all have heard that expression, oh, the spirit of the age is X, or this is the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. That is kind of what Hegel was referring to, but instead of looking at it as just the spirit of the age, he looks at spirit as developing. And that idea of spirit, I think, is incorporated into Marxism without the concept of spirit. That's just what we consider to be ideology and culture, and we take it deeper than Hegel. We're more concrete than Hegel because we see that spirit, or this realm of culture, this realm where humanity comes to understand itself through ideas, is grounded on the relations and the mode of production that humanity develops for itself in various eras. But I love this topic of religion and of the materialist critique. One of the interesting things is, as you know, in the school that we went to, the philosophy majors, I think most of them, if not almost every year before, like for before like maybe 5 years before we got there, almost every philosophy major was a seminarian, right? Which gets at some of the point that you're making, that
yes, yes.
they were forced to do it. That was the major that they had to take. But one of the interesting things that I found was that some of my friends that were in the major would have crises of faith when they read
Mm.
Feuerbach. Um,
Oh,
I tell this story when I teach
oh.
Feuerbach because I think it's interesting. But there was a friend of mine who, after reading The Essence of Christianity, he had a real crisis of faith, and it took him all summer to come back and decide that he wanted to stay in the department. One of the interesting things was that I think in that year, he might have been the only one of the maybe group of 4 or 5 that ended up staying. And he was the one that had the crisis. The ones that didn't have a crisis were the ones that ended up leaving, right? A year after, right? So
Huh.
they had a bigger crisis, but this guy had to tarry with Feuerbach. It produced a crisis, and then he kept on believing. Uh, but yeah, that Feuerbachian critique of religion is so nice. It's so
Mm.
nice. It's not as good as the Marxist one, but it's really really nice. The idea that we have a human essence that's dominated by love, that's dominated by reason and by will, by the ability to act, the ability to love, and the ability to reason. And that because we participate in it as individuals imperfectly, we end up doing things like, everyone is like that. You know, I failed my math test, but most people failed it. I cheated on my girlfriend, but most people cheat. I wasn't able to keep up with my diet, but most people break their diet, right? Those are all breaks of loving, reasoning, and willing perfectly. And in order to comfort ourselves, we attribute those limitations onto the species, right?
Mm.
And so Feuerbach's idea is that that's how God arises, right? You have in Christianity the idea of the imago Dei, that humans are made in the image of God. Feuerbach turns that upside down and says we have this human essence of reason, love, and will. People do it as individuals imperfectly in order to basically feel better about their imperfection. They apply those imperfections onto the species, but they retain the idea of the perfect. Because when you think about a limitation, inherent in the understanding of a limitation is something beyond the limit, right? If you look at a fence, you understand you're trapped in the fence because you can see beyond it, or at least because you have the idea of something beyond the fence. We can understand imperfect loving, imperfect reason, imperfect willing, because we can also comprehend the idea of perfect love, perfect will, perfect reason. And so we have to apply that perfection to something. And if we just tarnish the species because we said, oh no, everyone's like this, when we fuck up, we have to develop something new. And that new thing we developed is God. And what do you have in the tradition of Christianity? God is that being that is all perfect loving, all perfect knowing, and all perfect in terms of power, in terms of the ability to exert his will. He can do everything, he loves perfectly, and he has perfect knowledge. Reason, love, will, right? So that projection is what he says happens, right? Instead of humans being made in the image of God, humans, because of their deficiency, make God in the image of what is essentially the human essence, the species being. And this kid, after reading that, he was like, whoa. And he went into like this really deep crisis of faith. But
Huh.
he ended up pulling through, and he finished the seminary program. And I haven't touched base with him, but I think he's a father now. So
Huh. Well, I feel like that's, the ones who didn't tarry with it or who didn't have that crisis and who just left, were maybe the ones who like didn't fully engage with Feuerbach, or like, weren't open to changing their ideas or sublating their ideas, criticizing what they already believed and knows. So by tearing with that idea, he probably came out on the other side, with
Mhm.
a different form of faith than what he had going in, but still his faith, versus having a crisis and just leaving and saying, I'm not going to even engage with any of this anymore. And I've loved the concept of spirit. That's probably like my favorite part about reading Hegel. It gets me like excited just to read about. And I think I understood it pretty well, and I like it so much because of my religious upbringing and my faith, and my desire to be part of like a collective project, outside of the church. Um, but it sounds idealist, right?
Mhm.
Spirit, but it's not idealist. Like it's the opposite. Or it helps you, understand sort of the collective spirit of humanity that all religions are hitting at, without the mysticism and the dogma of religion. It allows, yeah, and I mean, you can see it. I think there's ways of proving that, some sort of spirit, even if you're just thinking of it, as an explanatory concept, that it exists. For one, you have Jonathan Haidt's concept of the hive mind, where, if you take LSD, or if you have this experience, like it can happen during sports,
Mhm.
if you win a big event with your team, where the ego or the individual sort of starts to melt away, and you see yourself, as truly just a part of this collective, is that being your true essence. And I feel like that's almost tapping into that collective spirit, or really feeling that idea that, we as humans are all connected, and our ideas develop with each other, and by bouncing them off each other. And Also, there's a saying in wrestling, you are the five people that you hang out with the most. I don't know if that's
Mhm.
wrestling, probably all sports, but basically you're a product of your environment. Because whoever you're around is basically who you're going to become. So like, if all my buddies are smoking 20 cigarettes a day, I'm going to be like, oh well, that's just what people do. I'm going to smoke 20 cigarettes a day too. And it shows there's sort of this collective, social aspect to behavior, where, we are not just who we are internally, which is the idea of liberalism. Just be who you are. There's some true you that's underneath, and that's what you need to be all the time. But the who you are can change, and it can change based on your environment, and it can change on how you interact with the collective thought or spirit, or people around you. But thank you, Ross, for the second super chat today. Thank you very much for your support.
I
Here.
wrote down that name so that I can look it up later, but I haven't heard of him. I don't know if it was in connection to the discussion that we were having on faith, but what's interesting is that faith is used a lot in Chinese Marxism,
Hmm.
like a lot. I've finished reading Cheng and Fu's China's Economic Dialectic, and he talks about faith in Marxism and then in the species of this species in speeches of Xi Jinping, faith is introduced as a concept, and then it's also introduced as a concept here and there in the discussions that um, God, what's his name? The Roland Bohr. That Roland Bohr, uh, uh, in his book "Socialism with Chinese Characteristics: An Introduction for Foreigners," he introduces the concept of faith in Marxism quite a bit. So I wonder if your mentioning of Yang Guorong is related to that comment on faith. Um, but I wanted to make also a comment. Maybe I should wait for Eddie because it might be a good discussion. But thank you, Pat Cummings. Pat Cummings runs a show called Coming from Left Field with Greg Goddles, who's an editor at Marxism Leninism Today. They've had both Eddie and myself on their show, and their show is honestly one of the most underrated shows on the internet. Their guests are fantastic, and they are wonderful, wonderful hosts. Their interviews are superb. I've seen basically every interview that they have done. Now I've gone back before they invited me, and I saw most of the ones that they did before me, and I've seen every single one that they've done after me, and it's just wonderful. Their guests are always really really good. So please check out their channel. Actually, let me link it to the chat so that people
Yeah.
can follow their channel.
Yeah, I love um the Coming from Left Field podcast with Pat. We've both been on it. I'm sure you said that already, but I mean, when we first made contact with them, I didn't really know. I was unsure about it. I'm like, who are these guys? Why do they want to talk to me? Like I just didn't know that much about them, and then I started watching their podcast, and even just really once I started talking to them, I was like, these guys are amazing.
Yeah.
I love these dudes. And then I started watching their episodes. I'm like, this is the most underrated, underviewed podcast on the freaking internet. I swear to God. So everyone, please check out their work.
Oh my God, their guests are always fantastic. They had Professor Moncrief, who she's a British scientist who focuses on the political economy of mental health systems. I used her work a lot in the recent article I did for the um, uh, I forgot the name of the website already. For the Science for the People magazine. I used her work quite a bit, and I actually found out about one of her articles through the interview that they did. And I think Eddie, you're using some of her work too now on the article that you did for the second issue of
Yep.
Jazz. So yeah, please go check them out. I linked their channel to the chat.
Yes, comingfromleftfield.com. Sometimes it's hard to find them on YouTube. They don't necessarily pop up if you search Coming from Left Field, but comingfromleftfield.com, and then yeah, Carlos posted the link. Obviously, I feel like I've seen these gentlemen once before, but YouTube algorithm didn't push them toward me. Of course not. Their work is too good, and too
Mm.
educational and too enlightening, for the algorithm to push it towards you. Yeah,
And
which is why it's hard to find them when you search them. Were you saying something?
oh, okay. I didn't
I'm
know
sorry,
that,
were you
that
saying
comment.
something?
I didn't
Oh,
know that comment you made was from the chat. I thought you were saying that, but um,
oh, gotcha.
Greg's work on Marxism Leninism Today and his blog, ZZ's blog, is also really really good. He's in he's a veteran Marxist Leninist who's been to use a sports reference, who's been in the game for a while, and
Mhm.
he's very smart. So I would definitely recommend his work. We republish some of the stuff he publishes on Marxism Leninism Today quite often. So please check them out. They're pretty great. Um, I saw
Yeah,
a comment
they're
about carrying, which is
oh,
that's stolen from Hegel. Yes, uh,
definitely learned that from Hegel.
47% of the words and analogies we use are stolen from Hegel.
um, yeah, I was gonna say, the Coming from Left Field podcast and the fact that people can't find it in the algorithm or the algorithm doesn't push it, which is something that I've noticed, people in the chat have noticed. It's a universal thing. Like, imagine what kind of effect that has on the populace overall, like
Mhm.
versus a country like China where they're pushing educational material, and there's a promotion of stuff that's science based and evidence based, versus in the US it's opposite. There's a push for these consumerist commodities, quick fixes, quick hits of dopamine, just the most entertaining, off the wall, absurd, ridiculous stuff that's going to entertain people for 2 seconds so they can move on to the next thing. And what kind of effect does that have on the consciousness? What kind of effect does that have on the spirit of the society that we live in?
Mm.
It's not good, I imagine. Versus, imagine if TikTok was, every other video was something entertaining but educational, like what we do. What kind of culture would that promote?
Right, right, and that's the TikTokization of thinking that we talked about with Ramiro quite a bit, but um, yeah, it's so addictive. I find myself, it happens to all of us. We critique it, but we're also living in the society that we're critiquing, so we're all bound to sooner or later uh, doing death scrolls for 3 hours at 3 in the morning, and you're like, what the fuck am I doing? Why am I doing this? Get off of the phone, and then you don't get off of the phone. Um, but I was gonna say something with relationship to that, but it's not coming to me. But I wanted to talk about the spirit, because you were mentioning it as a category that, although it sounds idealist, we shouldn't think about it in an idealist fashion. And I wanted to pull up a quote from Ilyankov, who I have in the anthology we just published. Evel Ilyankov was a brilliant Soviet philosopher and psychologist. One of my favorite, perhaps right behind Lenin. And he comes from this tradition in the 60s out of Lomonosov University. It's a tradition known as creative Soviet Marxism. It's a bit more theoretical than like the manuals, the Soviet manuals. I think the manuals are great for people just getting into Marxism. But for instance, I tried to read Ilyankov like 2, 3 years ago, before I had really uh, taken a year or so to just read Hegel, and I didn't understand them. I had to read Hegel in order to then go back. And when I read Ilyankov, I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant."
Hmm.
Um, but there's this quote that he says, and I've talked to you about this before. Thinking of spirit in terms of the concept of the ideal.
Yeah.
The ideal is a concept that Marx introduces in the preface to the second German edition of Capital, where he also talks about Hegel being upside down and declares himself a pupil of Hegel. But he brings about the concept of the ideal, and Evo Lilienkov is the person that systematizes this concept as best as possible. And he says that, let me see if I find the quote. Ilyenkov recognized the world historic value of Hegel's depiction of the objectification of thought through human praxis, and said that this development made a fundamental advance in the understanding of thought and in the science of thought. The Marxist concept of the ideal, which Ilyenkov would systematize, held that the ideal was the real, quote, real objective activity of man as the agent of social production. So the ideal, or there you can replace the ideal for spirit. It's something objective. It's not just ideas. Ideas don't float around in the ether. They're embodied in human minds that are engaging in concrete practice that is objective and social and historically determined. So that way of thinking about it, I think, shows that, this idea of the unfolding of spirit, that when it rolls out of the tongue, it sounds a little bit mystical and a little bit idealist, is not at all that idealist. It's just about the unfolding of culture, the unfolding of this realm of the ideal, which is objective. That's a materialist way of understanding ideas. Ideas are objectively grounded in social praxis. And just like the modes of production develop and the relations develop, so does culture develop along with it. And that's the unfolding of the ideal, or the unfolding of spirit, that Hegel talks about. So yeah, I think that this is incorporated into Marxism in a more deep, in a more thorough, and a more refined and more concrete manner. And it's not as I don't think we should just say no, that category of spirit or that unfolding of spirit in history, that's just idealist nonsense. It's
Mm-hmm.
not. And what's interesting is that when you look at Hegel, he understands very clearly that philosophy can only be its time grasped in thought. That
Yep.
every form of thinking is grounded on the sociality that thinking is centered in. So the social relations that exist, he's not thinking directly in terms of production, but he's almost there. He's flirting with it, right? Plekhanov has this article on the 60th anniversary of Hegel's death, and he provides a really close rating of the philosophy of history. And he says Hegel doesn't notice it. He's not self-conscious about it yet. But when he has to argue how it is that these historical epochs unfold into the other, he has to appeal because he's so smart and such a thorough investigator. He has to appeal to developments in the mode of production.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, yeah, and then what you find with the leading Marxist-Leninist scholars of the last 2-3 decades, Domenico Lasordo, big proponent of Hegel. His book Hegel and the Freedom of Moderns is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and it shows that that myth that Hegel is a conservative is bullshit. Hegel is not a conservative. The problem is that they think about the opposite of liberal as conservative, and Hegel wasn't conservative. His understanding of the state, which is usually seen as the most conservative part of his philosophy, was not conservative at all. He was just against laissez-faire capitalism and in favor of state intervention for the sake of the common good. And where do you have that? In China. In China, where a communist party runs society and keeps things keeps things in line and makes sure that if there's going to be a capitalism that exists, it's going to be kept in check so that there's no super exploitation, and so that what's done with the surplus benefits the whole of society, and so that poverty alleviation takes place, and inequality is combated with their new projects of common prosperity. That's a Hegelian understanding of the ethical state.
Yeah, and this reminds me of a polemic I got into. Well, kind of. I ended up blocking the guy because he was not actually interested in finding the truth. He was interested in being a dickhead. But we got into a polemic, and this dude is an anarcho-communist. He's actually like a soccer coach or something. Who was just commenting on all our videos, telling me that I'm distorting Marxism or whatever. So I finally responded to him, but basically explained what Carlos said, that Hegel was almost a proto-materialist, right? He like got very close to dialectical materialism or Marxist materialism just because he was such a thorough investigator. So you have various points throughout the lectures on the history of philosophy where he's saying, the whatever technological level of development in this area allowed spirit to develop there. So, by spirit, he means thought and, culture and politics. And he's saying, basically saying it developed because of the mode of production without saying it. So, it wasn't that Marx necessarily just reversed everything Hegel said and said the opposite, right? He made it materialist. He said, this culture and politics and stuff that Hegel's analyzing is based in and stems from the mode of production, the material. But Hegel approached that himself too. And, the anarcho-communists we were arguing with just kept quoting this one line where Marx said that he flipped Hegel on his head, basically saying that Hegel was an idealist versus Marx the materialist. And while Marx did kind of flip it on its head, he said it's the base that determines everything rather than just the superstructure. It's more complicated than, Marx just reversing everything Hegel said, whatever that would even mean, or it's more complicated than just saying Hegel was an absolute idealist, because he wasn't. And if you want someone good on TikTok who talks about this stuff other than me, this is my good buddy Henry. Henry's amazing. You can tell who does the reading when it comes to Marx and who doesn't. Henry does the reading, and he's also read a lot of the Austrians, like Austrian School of Economics, so he mixes that in with his Marxist analysis. But he's done work basically calling Hegel a proto-materialist as well. So there you go, a little TikTok recommendation for y'all.
Well, that's interesting because when you use that phrase, I was like, wow, he was able to engage with Lenin's volume 38, the philosophical notebooks, because that's what Lenin calls Hegel. After thoroughly reading Hegel, he says, proto-materialist is the It's the direct phrase, and then Engels calls it a materialism upside down. So it's not just uh, upside down, but it's a materialism that is upside down.
Oh, dang, I
Um,
wish I would have had those quotes. I was camping when I was in the polemic with that guy.
and what's interesting is that although Marx and Engels continue to play with the wording of upside down and of turning right side up, Engels has the essence of how we should think about the relationship between Hegel and Marxism, which is that Marxism takes Hegel to its logical conclusions. It takes Hegel beyond Hegel by being faithful to Hegel. And that's what I have a whole chapter on that in the bigger book project that I'm working on, which I'm hoping maybe sometime next year. But I have a chapter on the Marxist ablation of Hegel, and that's how I'm thinking about it. It's Marxism by being faithful to Hegel is able to go to the ends that Hegel would have gone to had he lived longer.
Hmm. Absolutely. That's a good way to think about it. That I'm going to use that going forward. I think that might be a good segue to talk about the article we're doing on Che here in the future, largely based on socialism and the man in Cuba, which is sort of a question of like, um, how is the socialist consciousness constructed, or how is the socialist individual, or what
Mm.
does the socialist individual look like? So it's a little bit like, what is the superstructural development of socialism? How should spirit develop under a socialist society? Looking at things like the Cultural Revolution, and people might not know this, but during the Sino-Soviet split, that was after the Cuban Revolution, or around the same time. And Che had his opinions on that, of course, and he was pretty pro Cultural Revolution and pretty pro Mao, and believed that the socialist consciousness needed to be cultivated, and it wasn't an overnight thing. It was a process of developing that consciousness, which he talks about here. With the history of the old, or the old society, makes itself felt on the consciousness of the new man, as they develop this new consciousness. But I think this is a really good way to think about it. I don't know where it went. Oh, there you go. Sometimes people think.
Oh, my bad.
Oh, you're good. It must have just brought yours up instead of mine. There we go. We think about the Sino-Soviet split and the Cultural Revolution. Um, a lot of Westerners like Cultural Revolution good or Cultural Revolution bad. But in China, they have like it's 70% this, 30% that. It's a mixture. And we do need to cultivate socialist consciousness, right? And we do need to combat like bourgeois consciousness and basically wage this ideological struggle beyond just changing the mode of production. So thinking about how to do that, and thinking about the mistakes of something like a Cultural Revolution is really important. And Che kind of does a little bit of that here, and more. But
Right. And I think that I think there's an echo there. Uh, I that's one of the things we were talking about before we went on stream is the how nicely it fits into Gramsci and the studies that I've been doing into Gramsci about the necessity of an intellectual and moral reform. Right? It's not just socialism is not just about changing structures or about changing some relations and some how institutions work. It's about changing human beings. It's about cultivating a new human being that is much more complete, that is able to flourish and be much more human, right? We're scared of this discourse, but socialism is deeply, deeply humanistic. It wants to create a society in which each human being can flourish and be the best they can be in a way that's compatible with the development and the flourishing of the community. And you can't have that under capitalism. You can't have that under capitalism. And if you have it, it's only for a select few amount of people. You can only have that under socialism. And I think a big part of what Che is dealing with in this work, which is extremely grounded in how they are attempting to think about socialist construction in Cuba, is the necessity of developing that consciousness. and he critiques some of the Soviet tactics used, for instance, the payments that are made on the basis of how much you produce, those sorts of material incentives. He criticizes them. He says that people should be able to work more on the basis of understanding that that extra work that they do benefits society, that it benefits their neighbors, not just because they make more or because they're paid on the basis of how much they make. They should be able to work more and make more things for society. And he has phrases that say something along the lines of voluntary work is the real school for socialist consciousness. And my grandfather,
Hmm.
who's um, one of the souls behind my struggle. I think I've mentioned them a few times before. He was a Catholic seminarian who, when the revolution takes place, he goes out in the squadrons that go to teach people that are in a campo, in the most secluded sections of the Cuban forest, to set up schools and medical clinics. One of the conversations that I had with him when I was young that really struck me, I always heard my mom complain how he was always coming home late. He was supposed to work to a specific time, and he would never come on time. And it's there's parts of the family that joke around and say, "Oh no, he was just a degenerate, and he would go out to drink or something," but that wasn't true. All of his friends were straight people who would say that no, he would stay overtime and work 3-4 hours overtime, and he was always getting medals for his work, but he wasn't getting paid extra. And so I grew up with my mom, with hearing my mom say, he was always overworking and he was never making anything. And I asked him one day, why would you do that? Like, why would you work more if you weren't going to make more? What was the point of that? And he's like, well, I wouldn't make more in the sense of how we think about making more today or in the US, but I was making more because I felt spiritually that when I would work extra, I would help more people. When I would stay there 3 or 4 hours extra, that's more work that I did that would help people in other communities of Cuba. If I laid 2, 3 pipes here, it can help water get to this other region of Cuba that doesn't have clean water. And he started telling me this, and I was like, holy shit, that's that's the socialist man. That's what Che's talking about. People who are able to work out of the understanding that their work helps their community. And I think that's a very profound transformation that we have to think about, not just having under socialism, but if we really fancy ourselves to be the vanguard, if we really fancy ourselves to be the sort of embodiments of the society that we want to construct, and that through that example we can bring others into the movement for socialism, we really have to think seriously about the ideas that Che Guevara talks about in this paper, because I know there's structural forces behind it. I've read Michael Keating and the book Socialism Betrayed that does a really, really good job at talking about why the Soviet Union fell. But at the end of the day, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Socialist Bloc had a hell of a lot more resources to continue fighting for socialism than did Cuba. But Cuba's around and the Soviet Union isn't. So there was a transformation there of consciousness that was more profound in Cuba than in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had it as well. It had it as well. If you talk to old people now in Russia, what they miss the most is that collective ethos. They had it as well, but it was more profound and pronounced in Cuba. And I think that's one of the factors that we have to always keep in mind. It's never one thing, it's always a variety of things. But I think that's one of the factors that we should keep in mind for why one is around, even though it's a small island with limited resources, with 75% of their arable land undergoing soil erosion, and the other one that had a lot more resources isn't around.
Yeah, I think we need to take these seriously and strive to develop the socialist consciousness ourselves, which is what Che, was so famous for. Like Fidel called him a man from the future,
Mm,
meaning he wasn't, burdened by the ideas of the past. He had this socialist ethic and socialist consciousness where he wanted to work for the benefit of everyone. And as individuals who are trying to spread this theory and organize workers collectively, like the more that we can cultivate and develop that socialist consciousness ourselves, even within capitalism, the better off we're going to be. And I want to talk about this a little bit, and then maybe we should move away from this because we're doing an essay on it soon. So I don't want to give away everything we're going to write about. But, in the Soviet Union as well as Cuba, there was an explosion of, and anywhere there's a socialist revolution, there's an explosion of artistic expression. Right, because people who have artistic ideas or want to be artists, have their needs met and they have more time, and they're trying to cultivate this culture where everyone has more time to do stuff like art. And I mean, really, if like super artistic people, usually they struggle to produce their own means of subsistence under capitalism. So if you start meeting people's needs, you're going to see this huge artistic explosion and a move to a higher culture. And that kind of shows the collective change of consciousness, I suppose. But I mean, I really like that idea of developing the socialist consciousness in the struggle. And we talk a lot about Che's idea of forging yourself in the struggle, which, Lenin talks about true revolutionaries are made in the struggle. And it reminds me, I wanted to do a video earlier, but I didn't end up talking about it. But Cuba has one of the best wrestling teams in the world. They're really, really good at Greco-Roman and freestyle wrestling. They have Olympic and world medalists every year. The best wrestler of all time, probably Mijan Lopez Nunez, the only 4-time Olympic champ ever, is from Cuba. And this is what their weight room looks like. This is what the Cuban wrestlers' weight room looks like. It looks far, far less high-tech than high school weight rooms in the U.S. by a long shot. And this is because of the embargo. This is because of the blockade. I don't know if there's a picture of the Cuban wrestling room here, but it looks about the same. Pull it up here. It's basically just a warehouse with, I don't even know if these are real mats. I'm pretty sure they had to make the mats themselves because they can't get the material because of the embargo. But despite this, they are one of the best teams in the world. Every single year, they cultivate these tough, explosive wrestlers who win world medals. And Mijan Lopez, after he won his 4th Olympic title and broke the record, he said, "Shout out to the big boss Fidel." So you see that's kind of at the center of their consciousness. And he's a big Afro-Cuban man, and you remember that Cuba had slave plantations in 1959. And without Fidel Castro, that might have been his future. But instead, they've cultivated this, collective consciousness where you have these athletes who are willing to train in a warehouse, a dusty ass warehouse with like rusted weights from the 1950s, because they want to compete for their country, because they want to compete for Cuba. And, with the way that they say, shout out to the big boss Fidel, they want to compete for the revolution. They want to show the world the strength of the revolution. And, that's the socialist consciousness. Like, I don't care about the lack of wealth, even though socialism is about increasing the productive forces, right? Cuba's still in the struggle. They're still trying to construct socialism and combat imperialism. The revolution is ongoing. So they're willing to throw themselves behind that revolution when they could have facilities like this, right? And there are Cuban athletes who moved to the U.S. like Yoel Romero. And, this is a tiny fraction of the U.S. Olympic Training Center, which is just an enormous facility. I've been there a handful of times. But the U.S. Greco wrestlers lose to the Cuban guys every single time. Doesn't matter how fancy our weights are. So yeah, I mean, maybe that kind of gives you an idea, a practical idea of that socialist consciousness in action.
Well, yeah, and VJ has said before, I just saw recently an interview he did in Mesa Redonda, a Cuban show, when he visited Cuba with Manolo de los Santos. He said that one of the most impressive things about Cuba is how many gold medals and how they do in the Olympics. Being such a small country of such limited resources, how well their athletics are. And it's in wrestling, it's in boxing. I'm sorry to my Mexican comrades, but Cubans have the best boxers in the world. That's a fact. That's an objective fact. I'm sorry, but it's a fact. Mexican homies are going to be so mad. I love watching Mexican boxing, but the Cubans got it. In baseball, in baseball, you used to have the Latin American games, and Cuba won like 27 out of 30, right? During the beginning of the first few years of the revolution. To this day, you know, every year in All-Star games, there's always a handful of Cubans. And as someone that used to follow baseball in Cuba, the ones that come here and then do amazing and become All-Stars and sometimes criticize the revolution, the ones that stay quiet when you go into their houses, as some that I've been able to go into their houses, you see their portraits of Che that they hide from the public in order to continue playing professional baseball. But the ones that come here, we're not the best ones in Cuba. The best ones stayed there, and they could be millionaires, multimillionaires, and they stayed in Cuba playing and representing the revolution. And that spirit, that socialist consciousness, that's what Che was talking about. That's what Che was talking about, and that's why, you know, regardless of the training facilities, regardless of the lack of means, they have some of the best athletes in the world because they fight for something else. They fight for their homeland. They fight for their revolution. They don't fight for money. They don't fight for status. They fight for their homeland. And that's beautiful. And, you know, there's this slogan that came up out of the protests in Cuba last year, July 11th, which they're not smart enough to even come up with their own slogan. But the slogan was Patria y Vida, homeland and life, which was already said by Fidel. But anyways, they took this up as the reactionary slogan. And the athletes that are aligned with the Miami Mafia and the Gusanos, they're all supposed to say Patria y Vida, right? The slogan of reaction. And in the recent Olympics that just passed, most of the boxers, when they finished, they went up to the camera and they said, Patria y Vida no, Patria o muerte venceremos. Homeland and life no, homeland or death, we will win, which is the slogan of the revolution. And it's beautiful. But where were these people trained? They were trained in Cuba. Even the ones that are rejecting the revolution, their success is a product of the success of the Cuban Revolution that without means was able to produce some of the best athletes in the world. It's the same thing with professionals. They get their nice free education in Cuba, and then they come here. All they have to do is transfer their degree. They don't go into the $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 of debt that professionals have to go into, and then they're able to work and have nice jobs. And then they criticize Cuba when they're a product of the Cuban society and the success that they have in medicine and engineering, whatever field they're in. It's because of Cuba, the society that trained them without having the means, having a constant hybrid warfare on them, and a blockade that's been condemned for the last 30 years by every fucking country on the planet. It's incredible. It's incredible the lack of self-consciousness of what their success is grounded on that they haven't. If they were even halfway decent, they would realize that the success that they can have here in professional sports and whatever it is, it's grounded on the Cuban Revolution and what it afforded them for free. For fucking free. In baseball, in order to go and even have a scout see you, you have to go to these things called showcases that cost $800, not including the hotel expenses, food, or any of that. So who's able to make it in baseball? I had the opportunity to play with some of the best people in the area that I was in. And the best players that I played with didn't make it because they were poor. And they weren't able to go to showcases and pay $800. They barely have food to eat. Their families didn't have money. They would save up years in order to be able to buy a glove. They had used bats. They were the best players, but they wouldn't make it because they couldn't pay what they needed to pay in order to go to the showcases.
And it's a very similar thing with wrestling, like just the training opportunities. And basically my parents knew that wrestling was my whole life in high school and college, so they would, you know, set other things aside, including like family vacations and stuff, to pay for my training. But then there were these kids I remember who would just go overseas all the time. They were going overseas at least 3-4 times a year to train. And, you know, I had coaches who would encourage me to do it. I'm like, I can't afford to go overseas, you know. And then I would look at the kids on our high school team who we convinced to go out for wrestling. And, they couldn't even afford to go to the club in Madison, which is 25 minutes away. And then there's some people who can't even afford shoes, and wrestling's an accessible sport because there's not much equipment. So it's cheaper, which is why part of the reason I really, really like it. And I think it's great for working class people, or if you're a high schooler who, wants to develop yourself and learn how to work hard at something. But yeah, there's this huge gap, or there's all this access to training that you get when you have money. And think about like American football players. Che talks about this in Socialism and the Man in Cuba, talking about the explosion of artistic expression. Under capitalism, it's only the most incredible artists who are subservient to the system, also, who don't, push the line and talk about revolution. Because even if you're a really skilled artist, they're not going to let you blow up if you're criticizing the system. So it puts all these fetters on art. But also then athletes, like 16% of football players, NFL players who make millions of dollars, go broke within 12 years. 16% of them, because they get a taste of that money of not having to grind every day for their means of subsistence and live in poverty. And they don't know how to handle it. And the system just tosses them to the side once they're not valuable anymore. Once they can't make money for multi-billionaire NFL team owners. And funny story, though, this is a little bit related, but what was the name of that international baseball tournament that they used to have, where it was like different countries would play against each other?
Oh, the World Baseball Classic.
Yes.
Right.
I was watching that at a wrestling tournament with this other kid who I did not like at all. And I remember him saying, like, Cuba beat the US, I think, or they beat some Western country, and he was like, "Do you think they're good because the government punishes their players if they don't do well?" Like, that was a legitimate question. Looking back, it was so stupid, and that probably wouldn't help. You'd probably get so fucking nervous if you knew your government was going to torture you. But the American exceptionalism, he couldn't even accept the idea that maybe Cuba was just better than the US, even though they're this small island country under an embargo. It had to be the authoritarianism of their government that helped them win in baseball.
Right. That's funny. Yeah, it's crazy because I mean, as you know, I grew up in Miami. Baseball was what led me to college. I only really went to college because of baseball. But I grew up in the circles of Cubans in baseball, and a lot of the kids who I would play with, their parents were from Cuba, and they had all these weird reactions. I've had friends that I would go with them to practice every day. And when I started supporting Bernie Sanders, the dad would stop letting the kid go practice with me or something. That's how crazy it is. It's funny. I did the video recently on Cuba and Hurricane Ian and the effects, and I don't think I mentioned communism or socialism or anything once. It was a very soft video to try to appeal to a lot of people, and I mentioned that the blockade should be lifted at least for 6 months in order to help Cuba get the resources they need. And people on Twitter, like I guess the Cuban Gusanos found it, and like 2 or 3 of them retweeted saying something along the lines of, "They should put a bullet in between this person's dome." It's like, what the fuck? They don't know how much that says about them.
Right?
That's what they don't realize, that says so much about the character of the sort of people that are against the revolution.
It does. Carlos says, we shouldn't allow hurricanes to kill people, and we should help people and build disaster infrastructure to prevent their death. And people say, we should kill you for supporting authoritarianism. Like, the government should kill you for being so authoritarian and totalitarian. Yeah, that says everything right there. And it shows
Those are
that,
the friends of liberty. Those are the friends of
right,
liberty and democracy right there.
exactly. And anti-authoritarians.
Right.
Yeah, whenever we have some Miami people in our comments on YouTube, I'm like, man, I don't even know where to start with this. I usually just ignore them.
That's the worst thing if there was something I had to criticize from Cuba, it'd be that somehow, some way, somehow, at some point, people who were there came here and became gusanos. Um, it's the lowest IQ group of people that you can engage with, at least with respects to these political issues. It's just, oh my god, there's no argument. It's just faith. It's the leap of faith, but in politics. Oh, but the blockade doesn't exist. How? Show me how. I'm showing you how it does exist. Either counteract the evidence I'm giving you, or give me your own evidence. And they just repeat the same shit in a different way. Oh, but trust me, it doesn't exist. That's bullshit. What? What are you talking about, bro?
It's the same with the Venezuelans and who our Colombian Gusano enemy, who I'm not even allowed to mention anymore because he tried to
Mm,
get us fired, go to our jobs. But it was just like I would like explain to him, how the economic sanctions on Venezuela were real. And once I started going into the evidence, he would have a fucking meltdown. He's like, you're a genocide denier. Like, couldn't think rationally about it at all. Cause it's just this dogmatic, low IQ fucking belief that Venezuela is just evil. And then, if I questioned it, oh, shut up, white boy. This is my home
mm.
country. Like, okay, you're still a right winger. Like, that, just because Donald Trump supporters live in America doesn't mean I think they're 100% right about everything. But yeah,
Right,
it's
right.
ridiculous.
That's such a weird appeal. Listen to X, and it's listen to people from X country. I mean, what the fuck do you think happens in countries? You think everyone just thinks the same way?
It's such a racist way to look at things.
Listen to Americans, and then we present Eddie Smith. This is how Americans think. Everyone's a communist here. What? It's- they're, they're so stupid. They're so incredibly stupid. And again, it's the idea that truth is tied to identity. And it's
Mhm.
another form of essentialism. And that's not it. Truth is tied to investigation, right? Marx and Engels discovered truth not because they were white or European. It was because of the method of investigation. As Kwame Ture says, you could have studied in Timbuktu the same things that Marx studied. And if you had the same method, you would have came to the same conclusions, right? Truth is not based on the identity of the person. It's based on who did the investigation, who did the job that is required in order to get to truth. The royal road of science is not easy to climb. That's why only few climb it so far. Hopefully in socialism, more will climb it. But yeah.
For sure. It reminds me of what Vijay said in his great talk, where he told David Harvey and some other Western Marxists, you live on the other side of imperialism, so you don't get it. But he's like, the Americans are always like, let's hear from an Indian. I'm like, okay, do you want me to bring Narendra Modi? He's like, you know how many fascist Indians I know? He's like, what class background? What politics? He's like, you just want any Indian?
Right. Right. It's yeah, he's even said it like there's bad Palestinians. There's Palestinians that are in favor of Israeli occupation. Like what does that, and that's what people need to understand, because it's so easy to fall even in people who consider themselves Marxists. It's so easy to fall into this identitarian form of politics. And I have a problem with even calling it identity politics, because it's class politics, right? When you're saying that the validity of a claim is based on someone's identity and not on their class position or their engagement in research, you're laying the grounds for the sort of stuff that you get with the pseudo radical, pseudo Marxist academia, right? With people like Cedric Robinson and his book Black Marxism, which was recently absolutely obliterated by an article that we published. I don't know if you want me to share it real quick, but
Yeah, go for it, please.
um, it was a conjunction by a few people. William Robinson, who's got some stuff that he's written that I do not agree with, but this article he wrote for the Philosophical Salon, we republished it. William Robinson, Salvador Rangel, and Hilborn A. Watson. It's called The Cult of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, a Proletarian Critique. They absolutely demolish this book, which is tossed around. If you say you're a radical or a Marxist in academia and that you're interested in issues of race, they'll smack you over the head with this big book, and they'll tell you, read this. And what you find is a bunch of mumbo jumbo essentialism that's completely divorced of class analysis, and that postulates racism as prior to capitalism, and as capitalism as almost epiphenomenal to racism. And it ends up in positions that allow you to continue supporting capitalism and imperialism through a pseudo woke or enlightened identity lens.
That looks so interesting. I'm pumped to read that. I've been getting into a lot of Adolf Reed's work, on similar stuff recently. It's just so fascinating, to hear he's had this criticism for a while, of the way that identity distracts from class politics, the way that identity politics is class politics, like you've said. It's interesting. So yeah, I guess we can transition. I don't know if Jacob is still in the chat, but Jacob recommended this video. Every time Carlos and I are together, we like to watch at least one absurd PragerU video. Seems to be something that we work into the schedule every time. So this one's called "What Was the Cold War?" This will be perfect. It's a short video. It's only 6 minutes. It's about the Cold War, which I would say is my number one area of expertise. And it's PragerU, so it's going to be hilariously dumb and easy to debunk. So, yeah. Any thoughts before we get started, Carlos?
I just wanted to pull up a comment here that I found hilarious. The blockade doesn't exist, but also it's justified. And if socialism is so great, Cuba should be like Wakanda, despite the blockade. Gusano logic. He's of course being ironic, right?
Yes. That's hilarious. All right, I guess I'll hit play on the PragerU vid.
From the end of World War II, the United States and its Western European allies were involved in a nearly half-century-long titanic struggle with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. It was cold only in the sense that the Russians and Americans never came to direct blows, but it was certainly not cold for the Cubans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and others who got caught up in the communists' relentless drive to destabilize the free, democratic, capitalist world.
Free, democratic, capitalist, words that all mean the same thing. It's actually a good point that the war wasn't cold for much of the global south and much of the countries like Korea, where there was all this fighting. But it was never the Soviet Union invading, right? It was the Soviet Union would support grassroots revolutionary movements that propped up on their own. And then like in Korea, the US would bomb 20% of the population, destroy the infrastructure, back a fascist dictatorship, manufacture a voting plan at the UN to split the country in half, occupy it. It was always, or like in Afghanistan, the Soviets were there trying to stabilize things and build hospitals and schools and help this Marxist democratic government take power when there were all these extremist groups and separatist groups. And then the U.S. funnels a bunch of arms and weapons to Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen so they could just massacre like literacy workers and stuff. So it's always like, there was a tweet the other day that said studying the Cold War is like, so the revolutionaries, the communists, with the help of the Soviet Union, taught a bunch of people to read. And then the U.S. gave a bunch of arms to terrorists who killed those people. And then Western academics are like, the communists are to blame. They shouldn't have taught those darn people to read. They were destabilizing the democratic free world.
Right. I love the association of those three words: free, democratic, capitalist. It only makes sense if in front of free and democratic capital. That's the only way it makes sense. Freedom of capital. Capitalist democracy, the democracy of money, right? Instead of the demos, right, which is people in Greek, you should put capital kratasy, or it just doesn't make any fucking sense, because the word democracy means Demos and Kratos, power. Demos is people, but it's not just people and vague. It's common people. It's poor people. It's the masses. It's in Spanish what you call it pueblo. And democracy, you cannot have it without socialism. Socialism is the only real form of democracy. And the way that these idiots lump words like freedom, democracy, to capitalism, it's just insane. It's an upside down world, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect way to think about it. And I mean, if you don't think about it already like that, when bourgeois ideologues say freedom, they mean freedom of capital. Start thinking about it that way next time you hear them talk about freedom. And it makes perfect sense because the neoliberals, the Milton Friedmanites, literally equate freedom with free markets, no social safety net, free trade, capital is allowed to invest, no labor regulations. The freer that capital is, the more that these neoliberals and capitalist ideologues or bourgeois ideologues will say that, there's freedom. Like in Chile, Allende was planning all these social welfare programs that Pinochet wiped out and allowed Western multinationals to pillage Chile, bringing unemployment up to like 20% and all these negative effects for the masses. But that's what the neoliberals point at and say is the best economy ever, the laboratory of neoliberalism. But all it did was provide maximum freedom for Western banks and Western multinationals. So, we always have to ask, freedom and democracy for what class?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is a good comment. Freedom of enterprise that doesn't inhibit my personal business, and democracy for me and my buddies to choose what's best for us.
Cuba is not a democracy now that the masses vote on referendums to decide their policy. It was a democracy when Western gangsters and capitalists used Havana as a brothel and casino, and made all the decisions and had slaves. That is democracy.
Even in their shallow view of democracy, which is just electoralism, the ability to vote, it doesn't make any fucking sense. In presidential elections, around 60 to 65% of Americans vote. In any election in Cuba, local, national, regional, you got 95% of people voting. 95% of people voting, and it's usually 97% of people in favor. Sometimes it's not like that. On social issues, the recent family code, it was 66 in favor, 44 against. But it's ridiculous. In local elections, you know what percentage of Americans participate? 27. It's like basically 3/4 of the population not engaged at all in local politics. And that's even just thinking about democracy in their very shallow way of thinking about it as just, going to the booth, pressing a button every other year, every 2 years, every 4 years. Even by their standards, they're not democratic. And that's why every recent study that comes out from even Ivy League schools, which are the institutions of bourgeois hegemony, even those studies show concretely that there's nothing near democracy in the U.S. What you have is an oligarchy, a small group of people who control the wealth, and because they have the wealth, they can decide what the fuck goes in politics. That's it. That's what you have.
Yeah, there was a recent third-party there's a third-party study that's done every so few years or so, asking people where they feel like their government serves them, where they feel like they actually have control, where it's the most democratic. And Cuba and China are top 10 in the world, and the U.S. ranks near the bottom, like 160th or something. So, yeah, even by the U.S.'s own standards of democracy, Cuba blows us out of the water. Yeah, and there's been an Ivy League study to say we're an oligarchy.
There were, to be sure, many morally complex moments during this long struggle, but the Cold War was, at its core, as clear a conflict of good versus evil as World War II had been. Just like that war, the Cold War was a death match between the forces representing freedom and the forces representing totalitarianism.
Just like World War II, it was a battle of good and evil. You had the Soviets who fought or who dealt 80% of the Nazi casualties. And then you had the U.S. and Britain who filtered Nazi officials and higher-ups into their institutions of power, and, carried on this giant hegemonic global empire which underdeveloped the entire global South. Just like World War II, the West are the good guys. And those Soviets who fought against capitalism and who fought against the Nazis in World War II, they are evil, plain and simple.
Right, because according to these guys, the Soviets are as bad as the Germans, right? And the Western, if you look back at before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin was warning that they should fight against Hitler. And the West did not want to fight against Hitler. They wanted Hitler to invade. Could we say Hitler?
Yeah, we can on YouTube and Twitch.
Okay. They wanted him to invade. They wanted Germany to invade the Soviet Union. They wanted each country to fight against each other so that one of them would be destroyed, and then they would fight against whichever one was destroyed. So they did not want to fight against fascism. They did not want to fight against Nazism. It was the communists who were the first ones to fight against fascism and Nazism. And the way that they just take this term, which comes from progressive liberals like Hannah Arendt, totalitarianism, in order to equivocate the Soviet Union and fascism, or communism and fascism, it's absolutely ridiculous. It is the epitome of bourgeois abstract thinking, which sees things completely divorced from any context, from any relations, from any interconnections, from any processes, from anything. It just sees, oh, state bad, two-state bad, totalitarianism, both bad. What? It's so incredibly stupid. It's so incredibly stupid. It sees the repression of one state, which represses the people fighting for freedom and minorities and marginalized communities, and it equates it to the repression of another state, which is in control of the people, repressing the enemies of freedom, repressing spies and people trying to overthrow a popular democratic socialist revolution. It's the same.
And that's what the idea of totalitarianism itself is, this concept of totalitarianism, which you see right here, freedom versus totalitarianism. It's conflating, the Soviet Union with the Nazis and saying these are both totalitarian. They're not different systems. They're not systems that were in conflict and fought against each other. They're the same dictatorship. And, it ignores all the evidence and all the real factors, all the material factors. That's just, a completely ridiculous way of thinking about things. But this idea has been propped up by the CIA and the ruling class for so long now. And, this book, which was heavily funded and supported by the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, called The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, came out right after World War II so they could push this stupid, wrong idea, that the Nazis and the Soviets are the same. So therefore, we're justified in doing whatever we want during the Cold War as long as it stops the spread of communism. We got to kill 20% of Korea's population in the name of human rights to prevent totalitarianism, which is a stupid, meaningless concept that doesn't mean anything. And, you have this book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The origins of totalitarianism are right here. This is the origin of totalitarianism, this dumbass CIA-backed book that kicked off the Cold War ideology. The Soviet Union was nothing like Nazi Germany, which is why they fought against Nazi Germany. But this concept of totalitarianism is so useful for the capitalists. And that's why it's still in use today. That's why 70 years later, the numbnuts over at PragerU still haven't come up with anything new. There's like, totalitarianism, socialism, authoritarian. And it's an easy argument to debunk, but yeah, it's useful. And a lot of people, still believe this, even though, Prescott Bush, this corporatist who made all his money allying with the Nazi parties in Germany, was George Bush's grandpa. And now we've had two Bushes in office. They were trying to put Jeb Bush in office. We have like literal Nazi oligarchs still running our government, but we're the good guys and the Soviets are the bad guys. Sure.
Right. Can I pull up a quick quote?
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed this, but the StreamYard changed share to present.
Yeah.
They're going bourgeois on us. Share, that's the socialist one. When we nationalize it, we'll go back to share. But let me click on present. this is something that I have my students read. But this is from Maximilian Robespierre and a speech he gave on the justification of the use of terror, and it's from 3 months before they killed him. So listen to this quote. It has been said that terror is the principle of despotic government. Does your government therefore resemble despotism? Yes, as the sword that gleams in the hands of the heroes of liberty resembles that which the henchmen of tyranny are armed. Let the despot govern by terror by his brutalized subject. He is right as a despot. Subdue by terror the enemies of liberty, and you will be right as the founders of the republic. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny, is force made only to protect crime, and is the thunderbolt not destined to strike the heads of the proud. So it's pretty badass because it's like, yeah, sure, totalitarianism. If you want to consider the sword of the freedom fighter the same as the sword of the person that decapitates fucking poor people, I guess it's the same. I guess, totalitarianism, haha, and that it's just abstract thinking. Oh, two facts look similar. They're the same. Forget about everything else.
Right. Not when they could just read like a 3-page writing from Ingalls called On Authority, and they wouldn't have all these dumbass misconceptions.
Right.
Because hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in it, the Cold War can, with good reason, be described as the Third World War. The instigator of this war was Joseph Stalin, the mass-murdering dictator of Russia and of the many non-Russian peoples he had incorporated into what was known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. Stalin knew that his Soviet armed forces could not take on the might of the Free West. Instead, he decided to wage this fight through the use of proxies and by a massive use of disinformation.
So this is all projection, like the US always does. They were doing proxy wars. No, they weren't. They were funding and helping revolutionary movements who were battling the Contras or the Syngam-Rhee government in Korea, or the US-backed forces in Vietnam, who were terroristic, US-armed, US-backed right-wing neoliberal forces. And the U.S. was waging hybrid wars, proxy wars, or just real wars. And, this guy says, maybe even 1 million people died in the Cold War. Like, the U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Korea. The U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Cambodia. The U.S. committed genocide in Cambodia. The U.S. killed more than 1 million people in Vietnam. Like, the death count from these proxy wars is absurd. And it's well over, the number of people who died in the Soviet Union. And, of course, they have to bring up Stalin and act like somehow Stalin claimed control of all of Russia, plus all of the Soviet states himself, and he just forced everyone into this position, which reminds me of something that that I read today in Socialism and the Man in Cuba, the Che book, where Che talks about how hard it is to consolidate support of the people. And how hard it is to create a state apparatus that actually is connected to the masses and connected to the people. And he says anytime the socialist government starts to become disconnected from the people, you see discontent, right? People no longer support the revolution. People have criticisms, and they'll get mad. So in order to keep the revolution going, you always have to remain connected to the people and act in the interests of the people. And Derek Ford, who told us a lot about his time in North Korea, he was saying, like, if North Korea was what the U.S. actually said it was, the people would have risen up right now, right? Like, nobody would allow themselves to, no entire country of people would just be ruled by this one guy, with an iron fist. The communist and socialist revolutions have to consolidate support of the people. That was the number one goal of the Chinese Communist Party after the revolution. Consolidate the people's support. So if Stalin's just murdering people left and right for fun without reason, he wouldn't have stayed in power. the reason Stalin had such a cult of personality was because he so thoroughly, served the revolution, served the workers and the people every step of the way. And yes, a cult of personality developed around that, because he was greatly admired by the working class. But that developed not because he was disconnected from the people, this, iron fist ruler, but because he was connected to them. And he was literally a working class person himself.
Oh my God. It's so funny to hear about the cult of personality when, like, around me, there's like fucking 6 houses with 3,000 DeSantis flags.
Right.
But, but that's so absolutely ridiculous. It is so ridiculous, and it is grounded on Eurocentrism and Western racism because it holds the people of the East and of the global South who had socialist projects of construction. It holds them as too stupid and too weak to overthrow their dictatorial rulers, but yet at the same time, paradoxically, so strong that they can wage these iron fist dictatorships and kill millions and millions of people. It's these paradoxes of racism and of Eurocentrism, of American exceptionalism, which ground the ideology which with which the West and the capitalist imperialist world looks at the East.
Absolutely.
And misinformation. His initial prey was Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as well as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Stalin had troops in all these countries at the end of the war. Despite what he promised American President Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader had no intention of removing them, and gaining control over their governments proved to be quite easy. In March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. When Stalin threatened both Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman finally had enough. The so-called Truman Doctrine was born. The United States and its allies would not permit.
After years and years of Soviet aggression, Truman had finally had enough, ignoring the fact that every Western power landed troops in Russia right after the revolution to try and destroy the workers' government before it even got off the ground. Ignoring all the sanctions that the U.S. put on them and the proxy war that they tried to wage against the Soviet Union. It was all for the sake of human rights. And it's funny, too, that they say that Stalin had troops all over. Stalin had troops in all these countries. That's proof that he's imperialist. Okay, the U.S. has 1,000 foreign military bases, and, the second most or the country with the second most military bases, I think, is Russia with like 12. So you just admitted that the U.S. is the worst, most violent imperialistic force in the history of the world, because you said if someone has troops somewhere, that means they're imperialist. And also, I like I always think it's interesting when ruling class ideologues use the word misinformation. That's like the new conspiracy theory. Everybody who doesn't agree with us is a conspiracy theorist, and they're spreading misinformation. And we covered a video, or I did a video today on TikTok responding to this article from the Brookings Institute, which is a conservative think tank funded by billionaires. But they said they were talking about how podcasters are spreading Russian propaganda. And saying that there's no evidence Russia blew up their own pipeline, but there is evidence that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And the Brookings Institute was saying these are conspiracy theories being spread by podcasters when, quote unquote, the majority of experts believe Russia did it. And then you click on the little experts tab on their page, and it's Western bankers and financial executives and former State Department officials, one of whom worked with Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton, and they were bragging about that in their Brookings Institute profile. So it's like these experts are lying imperialist ghouls who are willing to kill as many people as they need to make a quick buck, and anybody who questions them is the conspiracy theorist.
Right, and it's one of the things that Chomsky notes, and of course we have some criticisms of Chomsky, but he's right to say that even a basic level of decency to avoid hypocrisy is absent from these people. Right? How can you talk about Soviet troops in places of the world when your country has 900 bases around the planet? How can you talk about that? What? You're a fucking hypocrite. That's what it is. And Chomsky's right. Even if they were at least halfway decent people that didn't want to be hypocrites, they could be like, well, okay, this one bad, but we're also shit. That's at least someone not hypocritical. I think it's wrong, but it's just complete an assault on human reason, and an assault on human decency. How hypocritical these fucking liars are. They're just liars. They're lying their ass off, and they know that they're lying.
They do. They have to. I mean, at this level, when you're talking about PragerU people, like, they know what the U.S. military does around the world. They're the people who fund the Atlantic Council and these, literal mouthpieces of imperialism. They're the people who are invested in the military-industrial complex. They're the ones making money off war. Guys like this, which makes it even more disgusting when they come out here and defend it. And it's like, the level of lies and hypocrisy. But I mean, to be a warrior for your class as a capitalist living in modern day, you just have to be a piece of shit liar. You have to be an American psycho, basically. So now we have people like this and Dennis Prager.
Someone brought up Jeffrey Sachs. I'm trying to find the...
I did a video on that already. I just uploaded it to our YouTube, actually.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to say real quick that Jeffrey Sachs is what you get when you're just a halfway decent human being with good intentions and some critical thinking skills. You don't have to be a Marxist. But if you have somewhat the interest of human beings at heart, and he considers himself philosophically an Aristotelian aligned with the pragmatist tradition, and you have some critical thinking skills, you end up like Jeffrey Sachs, which is, largely, I don't think I've seen a video of him missing. Maybe that's because the ones that pop up are just the ones where he hits the nail on the head. But he's almost always in the same position politically in terms of geopolitical analysis as Marxist-Leninists who apply the dialectical materialist method correctly.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to watch the video I did on that after this, we can. It's really short, like a TikTok, but yeah, you can tell he's like nervous when he's on Bloomberg because he knows that they're probably going to react like that, but he's literally just telling the truth. Like, he's literally just stating very basic facts, and they flip out.
My question is, how do they still let him go on? Because he's been doing it for like a while.
Right. I quote him in my Venezuela thesis a bunch. He's like one of the most cited economists in there. He's been at it for a while.
Right. Pretty soon you won't see as much of him because I don't think they want to keep having him on. It's too. You can tell they don't. Like, they rush to get him off air.
Yeah, I think the Bloomberg people literally pulled him when the most recent one was going on.
Right. I don't think he's going to get much airtime pretty soon. People are going to catch up, and they expect this big Columbia professor to be ideologically aligned with empire. And then, just because he's a decent human being who can think critically, he's consistently in a position that's, at least through his geopolitical analysis, anti-imperialist.
Right. He's a decent and honest human being.
Right.
Which, yeah, his credentials make it seem like he's maybe right-wing, but then you talk to him and he's not.
Any further expansion of the communist empire. The Cold War was on. For the next 5 decades and across 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, the US and the Soviet Union battled for influence, sometimes overtly, like in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes covertly through their various spy agencies. But the moral lines of this battle never changed. The freedom of the West versus the communist tyranny of the Soviet East. There are, nonetheless, as there were even at the time, those who argue that the Cold War was an overreaction by the West, that the ambitions and strength of the Soviet bloc were greatly exaggerated, and that America, with its massive defense build-up, was just as responsible for the Cold War as was the Soviet Union. But this simply isn't true, as an immense amount of archival evidence from Russia, not available until after the Cold War ended, now proves. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, stated Soviet intentions plainly in 1956. "We will bury you," he told the West. Nor would any amount of negotiation.
I mean, to take a quote that small, like, and take it out of context and be like, he said, "We will bury you." He could have been talking about like a dog, or like, it is such a small quote. And you have mountains and mountains and mountains of Marxist literature that the Soviet Union produced and based their society on. Like, let's just ignore all that and pick out the "We'll bury you" line. And the U.S. and Soviets did not battle for Korea and Vietnam. The Soviets were not battling for Korea and Vietnam. The U.S. was massacring people, dropping Agent Orange and napalm on them and bombing their infrastructure. And the Soviets gave mild support to the democratically supported revolutionary movements in those areas, while the U.S. was supporting right-wing extremist separatist forces. Or not separatist forces, but right-wing extremist pro-U.S. forces. And also just there's literally no argument in this PragerU video.
None.
There's no argument at all. There's no evidence, and like this kind of stuff makes people dumber because you don't know how to argue. There's no evidence. Just freedom-loving West versus dictatorial communist Soviet Union. That's it. That's the end of the argument. And this is how a lot of Americans think. And it's interesting once you start questioning them, like, why do you think that about the Soviet Union? Why do you think that about China? They can't explain it. They have no freaking idea. There's like, 1 million people died and communism was evil, bad because of stuff like this. There's no evidence, no facts. They just repeat over and over and over again in a high volume. Communism evil, communism dictatorship, communism doing proxy wars and undemocratic, and everything that capitalism is, actually, that's communism.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's what I was thinking about. He says that is just not true. And then I'm like, okay, let's see the argument. No argument. Just all he said was the archives prove it. What the fuck? Imagine you come towards me and you tell me something, I tell you that's just not true. Go talk to Bill. How is that convincing? That's not an argument. That's not an argument. That's an appeal to authority, to these archives that have been shown to have been tampered a lot of the times by the right wing and the reactionaries that took power after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. That's just a fact. That is a fact. That a lot of those archives were tampered.
Factual. And it's the same argument like as the Brookings Institute saying, the expert said this about Russia. Okay, there's literally zero evidence, and an overwhelming amount of evidence points to the fact that the U.S. did it. But if you bring up evidence, you're a conspiracy theorist. These experts who are actually just State Department officials and Western banking executives, they are the arbiters of truth.
Right.
Negotiation, détente, as it was called then, have led to a just conclusion of the war. The American diplomat George Kennan rightly warned that short of becoming a communist country, there was nothing the United States could do to gain the Kremlin's trust. The Soviets could not be appeased, only contained. But even containment was an inadequate strategy. Yes, the Soviet Union could not have beaten the US in a head-to-head confrontation, but it didn't have to. Victory in the Cold War would have allowed it, through intimidation and subversion, to dominate the globe, making communism, rather than democracy and capitalism, the preeminent ideology.
It's like they're so scared of communism and socialism because they know it is the future, the right way to move forward. And they're like, it would spread all over if we didn't massacre everybody who supported it.
Right. And I can't help but think, like, imagine if Midwestern Marx had like the funds in order to have nice little videos like this, but except that instead of having like non-arguments, we would have arguments and, these streams, but like really, really nice designs. I was looking at the design. I'm like, damn, that's dope. That's why people follow these idiots. You have a nice fucking dude with a haircut and a suit, and then you have really nice graphic designs. That's how you sell, people in an age where the TikTokization of the brain has occurred.
Yeah, it's like those infographics videos I always react to, where it's just these little cartoons of, Stalin murdering a million people, and this is what history was, but it's short and bite-sized. People eat it up.
Yeah.
There were many times during the 5 decades of the war that it seemed like this would be the case. But thanks primarily to the strong leadership shown by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Soviet Union was, at the close of the 1980s, to use historian Paul Johnson's description, a bewildered giant, economically bereft, militarily exhausted, no longer able or willing to enforce its will. Communism had failed in every possible way, economically, politically, morally. It had tried to create a utopia on Earth and instead created hell for all of the nations that came under its sway. Yes, the forces of liberty eventually won the Cold War, but this triumph offers little consolation to millions who died or suffered needlessly through no fault of their own for a never viable and now badly discredited cause.
This is like the most weaselly looking man ever. It's like such a perfect encapsulation of capitalism. Like, this is freedom when little weasels like this, who have never worked a day in their life, run everything and own everything, and you're not allowed to question their ideas. Otherwise, you're a conspiracy theorist. That's capitalism for you. And, the Cold War didn't end with a bang. It did. It ended with a lot of bangs. The first one was the U.S. invaded Iraq in the Gulf Wars, that bombed Iraq to a pre-industrial state before putting sanctions on Iraq, which would lead to 500,000 plus deaths, which Madeleine Albright famously said was worth it on 60 Minutes. But Vijay Prashad says in Washington Bullets that as the U.S. was bombing Iraq's infrastructure, Saddam Hussein was like, what's going on? Where's the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union was in the UN Security Council, and they were providing this umbrella of protection over much of the Middle East and much of the global South. After the Soviet Union was dissolved, the U.S. was free to bomb infrastructure and massacre people without that umbrella of protection. So you have immediately the invasion of Panama, which kills a bunch of people and overthrows Noriega. And the Gulf War, followed by, a series of interventions, including the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1998. And at the beginning of the 2000s, obviously, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the beginning of this quote unquote war on terror. But there was a huge uptick in U.S. interventionism and the brutality and the just like sheer like pig shit ignorance. We're not even going to justify this. We're just going to roll in and start killing people. That the U.S. started doing after the Soviet Union fell and there was no longer that umbrella of protection.
Right. And not just like a physical bang as all these things, but, how can you see what happened to the people that lived in the former Soviet Union and not consider that a bang? That's the quickest lowering standard of living in the history of humanity. 40 million people tossed into poverty out of nowhere, right? The stuff that happens during this shock doctrine, this restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, is insane. The lives of people are destroyed. Prostitution runs rampant. Drugs run rampant. Oligarchs start popping up everywhere. Mafias and cartels. The country that was once owned by its people gets sold off to a bunch of billionaires, oligarchs. It all goes to shit. The people started living a lot shorter. Their life expectancy dropped by like 10 years. Infant mortality dropped. It was all horrible. It was horrible. And how you can speak about somehow there not being a boom, it's just complete ignorance of the situation, that not just what you mentioned, of course, right? The actual booms that the U.S. was able to wage all over the world now that the one major force that was defending colonial people was gone. But the boom that was affected by hundreds of millions of people that were now tossed into destitution after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Even the people in like Romania or Albania or late Yugoslavia, where the socialist experiments were kind of starting to collapse anyways, there were a lot of legitimate criticisms, towards like the 90s of the Soviet leadership or of the party bureaucracy. Even those places, the people who supported, the revolution and overthrow of or dissolution of the Soviet Union were like, holy shit, after the shock therapy actually happened. There was something like a million people in Romania who were like pushed towards malnutrition or into malnutrition or poverty because the state-run industries were just sold off for pennies, and these were state-run industries that everybody was employed by, and all of a sudden they're run by corporations who aren't going to employ you if you're not making them profit. So those people lose their jobs when for years and years and years, they had thought that you lose employment, the state will give you employment. And a lot of them kind of fell for this, consumerist branding of the West. Like, look at all the riches of capitalism, look at these giant skyscrapers and all this consumerism we have. And, it's like, okay, but, the socialist countries had security for working people. And, that's kind of something that until you lose it, I think it was hard to understand for a lot of people what they had. But after they lost it with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they're like, oh my gosh, which is why such high percentages of people want to return to that economic model in the East.
Only know you loved it when you let it go.
The
I don't know, who was that? Ed Sheeran or something?
Lumineers.
I love
I
the
used to be
Lumineers.
able to play that on guitar. I don't think I can anymore.
Right. that's what happened over there, man. You only knew how much you should have appreciated when you let it go.
It's true.
We have to make a tanky remix of that song now.
Maybe that should be the Midwestern Marks intro that Noah and I make.
And you let it go.
Do you want to watch the TikTok on Jeffrey Sachs, or do you want to save it for later? I guess we've been going forever.
Yeah, I'm super tired. I'm okay with saving it for later.
Definitely. Well, thank you everyone for hanging out with us. This has been a great 3-hour stream. I streamed like 5 hours today, so it's been really fun hanging out with everybody. Definitely enjoyed this today more so than I would have enjoyed doing homework or whatever. So yeah, much love. Check out Carlos's book, midwesternmarks.com, in the store section. Really pumped about that. We got our patreon.com/midwesternmarks. And yeah, follow us everywhere else. Any last words, Carlos?
Well, thank you to everyone who watched it. And for those of you, if you decide to buy the book, please let me know what you think. I'm really hoping that this book helps people solidify the dialectical materialist outlook. And always, our theory is always grounded on changing the world. So if it helps you understand the outlook better, I'm really hoping that it likewise helps you understand the approach that we have to take towards changing this hell that we live in better as well. So, if you pick it up and you have any comments, please feel free to give me any feedback on the book if it helps, if there's anything that you thought I should change or something. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yes, I'm super excited to hear people's reaction to that as well. So thank you, everyone. Solidarity. See you next time.